Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to talk about the sponsor for this video, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is a service that takes the hassle out of trying to offload your extra cards. They provide top buy list value for your cards without all the extra effort of traditional buy listing. The service is quick and easy. Simply send them your unsorted cards, and then Card Conduit will sort, grade, and find the best buy list price for each of your cards. They are fully transparent, giving you a detailed report of exactly what you sent and what they are paying you for each card. You can also see exactly what you'll get for your cards ahead of time by going to their price check tool on their website. Their fees are reasonable and their customer service is fantastic. They process quickly and submit their payments super fast. I personally used Card Conduit twice before they ever became a sponsor. They were amazing, guiding me through the process and clarifying any questions or hesitations that I had. I got a fair price for my cards, and they literally saved me dozens of hours in the process. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. So give Card Conduit a try today. I will be using them for all of my extra cards from now on, and I recommend that you do the same. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum Ludovic's Opus. Also called Blue Farm, this is the king of mid-range decks. This deck is all about speed and precision. It puts together wins off of single card enablers like Ad Nauseam or Intuition. It thrives on fast mana, fueling either early game dominance with Kraum or Rhystic Study, or setting up wins with Underworld Breach or Thassa's Oracle. It can mulligan extremely well because both of its commanders are card advantage engines by themselves. This deck isn't here to play fair, it's here to outpace the table. Whether it's jamming a turn 2 Ad Naus or grinding value through card advantage, this deck keeps the pressure on from the first turn of the game. A number of these games were recorded before the bans, so strap in and see why Tymna and Kraum is the powerhouse we know it to be. Sasha draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. She casts a Mox Amber. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She casts Wishclaw Talisman. She passes. Corey draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cranks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora and passes. Ian draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Deathrite Shaman and ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Corey draws. Ryan ships the turn. Sasha draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Corey pays to keep his Remora. He draws, takes no actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. Ian draws and plays a Boseiju who endures as his land for turn. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. He activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling a land from Corey's graveyard to help cast Polywog Prodigy. Ian ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Ob Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. Ryan gives the turn to Sasha. Sasha draws and casts Rite of Flame. Remora triggers and Corey draws a card. Then Sasha adds 2 red. She casts Rhystic Study. In response, Ian casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card. Remora triggers and Corey draws again. Rhystic is countered and exiled, and Sasha passes to Corey. During his upkeep, Corey lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Rite of Flame, adding 3 red due to Sasha's Rite of Flame in her graveyard. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Corey creates 3 treasures. He dashes in Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He moves to combat and attacks Sasha with Ragavan. She takes it, Ragavan triggers, Corey creates a treasure, and Sasha exiles a Demonic Tutor off of the top of her library. In his second main phase, Corey casts Demonic Tutor from exile, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Mox Opal. Polywog Prodigy triggers, and Ian draws a card. He casts Esper Sentinel. Finished up, Corey passes. Ian draws and taps Elves of Deep Shadow, adding a black. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Ryan exiles a command tower off of the top of his library. Ian casts his commander, Glarb Calamity's Augur. It resolves, Polywog triggers, and gets a +1/+1 counter. Ian moves to combat and attacks Sasha with Polywog. Sasha takes 2, and Ian passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a command tower from exile as his land for turn. He casts Cataract Parasite. In response, Ian pays 2 life to cycle Street Wraith. In response, Ryan flashes in an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, pings Ian for 1, and Ryan amasses Orcs 1. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Skirk Prospector. Then Ian draws from Street Wraith, Bowmasters triggers, pings Sasha for 1, Ryan amasses 1, then Ob Nixilis triggers again. It gets a counter, then Ryan exiles a Dark Ritual. Next, Ryan casts Chrome Mox. Esper and Polywog trigger, Ian draws, then Bowmasters and Cataract Parasite trigger. Ian takes 1, Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, then Ryan exiles a Dockside Extortionist. Then Ryan pings Ian for 1 again, amasses Orcs 1, Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Mox Opal. Then Corey draws from Esper Sentinel, and Bowmasters and Parasite trigger again. Corey takes 1, Ob Nixilis gets a counter, Ryan exiles Font of Fortune, then Ryan pings Corey for 1, amasses 1, Ob Nixilis gets another counter, and Ryan exiles Simian Spirit Guide. Then Chrome Mox resolves, and Ryan imprints a Fire Covenant. Next, Ryan casts Mox Opal from exile. Polywog triggers, Ian draws, Cataract and Orcish Bowmasters deal 1 each to Ian, Ryan amasses, Obnixilis gets 2 counters, and Ryan exiles Opposition Agent and exiles a Mox Amber. Ryan casts Mox Amber from exile. Polywog triggers, Ian draws, takes 2 from Cataract and Bowmasters, Ryan amasses 1, Obnixilis gets 2 counters, then Ryan exiles a Diabolic Intent and a Tybalt's Trickery. Ryan casts Dark Ritual from exile. Ian draws from Polywog, takes 2 from Cataract and Bowmasters, Ryan amasses 1, Obnixilis gets 2 counters, then Ryan exiles Jessica's Will and Barbarian Ring. Then Ryan adds 3 black. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Ryan creates 6 treasures. He casts Imperial Recruiter. In response, Ian activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling a land from Ryan's graveyard, adding a black. He casts Dark Ritual. Esper triggers, Corey draws, Cataract and Bowmasters trigger, Corey takes 2, Ryan amasses 1, Obnixilis gets 2 counters, and Ryan exiles Coruscation Mage and Prosper Tomebound. Then Ian adds 3 black. He flashes in an Opposition Agent. In response, Ryan casts Tybalt's Trickery from exile. Agent is countered, Ian mills 3 cards, then exiles a Time Twister. Staring down Cataract Parasite and Orcish Bowmasters, Ian decides not to cast it, putting them all on bottom. Then Recruiter resolves. It triggers, and Ryan fetches up a Walking Ballista into his hand. Ryan casts Agatha's Soul Cauldron. He casts Walking Ballista where X equals 0. In response, Corey casts Strict Serenade. This is when Corey realized he probably should have countered Soul Cauldron instead. So Walking Ballista is countered, and Ryan creates a 2/2 bird. Ryan activates Soul Cauldron, exiling Walking Ballista from his graveyard. He activates Walking Ballista's ability on Obnixilis due to Agatha's Soul Cauldron, pinging Corey for 1. Obnixilis gets a counter, and Ryan exiles from the top of his library. Ryan presents a loop of removing a counter, pinging an opponent, and getting the counter back from Obnixilis' ability. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Ryan wins the game. Corey draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Jewel Lotus. He casts a Soul Ring. Corey passes. Ian draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Ian passes. Ryan draws and also plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. Ryan ends his turn. Sasha draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. She casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. She casts Necropotence. In response, Ian casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering Necropotence. Sasha casts a Mana Crypt. She casts her commander, Rograk. Sasha gives the turn to Corey. Corey draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora. Corey passes to Ian. Ian draws and plays a Bayou. He casts Chrome Mox. Remora triggers and Corey draws. It resolves and Ian imprints a Swansong. He casts his commander, Glarb. Kraum triggers and Corey draws again. Glarb resolves and Ian passes the turn. Ryan draws and casts Dark Ritual. Remora triggers and Corey draws a card. Then Ryan adds 3 black. He casts his commander, Obnixilis. Kraum triggers and Corey draws again. Ryan ends his turn. During her upkeep, Sasha wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. She cracks it and pays a life. Obnixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Mayhem Devil. Then Sasha fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. She casts Witchclaw Talisman. Remora triggers and Corey draws. She activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into her hand and giving Witchclaw to Ian. Sasha passes. During his upkeep, Corey lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Cabal Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Necropotence. He taps City of Brass, taking the damage. Obnixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Cabal Ritual. Corey casts Valley Flood Caller. Next, Corey activates Necropotence 30 times, paying 30 life, exiling 30 cards. Obnixilis triggers 30 times, gets 30 counters, and Ryan exiles 30 cards. Corey moves to his instep and puts the Necro cards into his hand. In the instep, Corey flashes in a Mana Crypt through Valley Flood Caller. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Pyroblast. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Final Fortune, getting an extra turn. He casts Talisman of Dominance. He casts Talisman of Progress. Corey discards the hand size, exiling the discarded cards, moving to his next turn. During its upkeep, Corey wins his Mana Crypt roll. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Savine's Reclamation, exiling it through Necropotence. Corey taps his Talisman for blue, taking a damage. Obnixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles an Orcish Bowmasters. Corey casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Demonic Consultation onto the top of his library. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Corey creates 3 treasures. He taps his other talisman for white, taking a damage. Obnixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a card. Corey casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to Crombat and attacks Sasha with Kraum. Sasha takes it, and in his second main phase, Corey pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Obnixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles another card. Corey taps his City of Brass, taking a damage. Ob triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a card. Corey casts Tainted Pact. He exiles from the top of his library until he reveals a Thassa's Oracle, putting it into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and since his library was almost entirely exiled with Tainted Pact, Corey wins the game. Matt draws a card for turn and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts the Talisman of Progress. Matt passes. Nabil draws and plays a forest. They cast an Exploration. They play a tropical island as their exploration land for turn. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Allosaurus Shepherd. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Mike passes the turn. During its upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Sea of Clouds. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Krombat and attacks Mike with Kraum. Mike takes it, and Matt ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. They cast Collector Roof. They play a Boseiju, who shelters all as their exploration land for turn. Nabil gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a forest. He casts a Bloom Tender. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Allosaurus Shepherd. Matt takes it, and Alex passes. During its upkeep, Mike pays to keep his Remora. He draws, misses his land drop, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Tyrannith Magistrate. The table starts to feel the pressure as Matt moves to combat. He attacks Nabil with Kraum. Nabil takes it, and Matt ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays an island. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays an Alchemist's Refuge. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Allosaurus Shepherd. Mike takes it, and Alex passes. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Kraum and Mike with Drannith. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming human as it enters. Matt ships the turn. Nabil draws and casts Trade Routes. Nabil passes. Alex draws and casts Thought Vessel. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with both of his creatures. Mike takes it, and Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Mike casts Vampiric Tutor, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and losing 2 life. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Matt's Kraum. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Kraum back to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Gilded Drake, Alex with Drannith, and Mike with Tymna. They all take it, and Matt gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Matt pays 3 life and draws 3 cards through Tymna. He casts Grand Abolisher. Matt passes to Nabil. Nabil draws and taps Boseiju, who shelters all, to help cast Beast Within, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Drannith is destroyed, and Matt creates a 3/3 beast. Nabil plays a Windswept Heath for turn. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. They cast Azusa, Lost But Seeking. Nabil ships the turn. Alex draws and casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Manglehorn. It enters and destroys Matt's Talisman. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Shepherd. Mike takes it, and Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and casts Reanimate, targeting Hullbreaker Horror in his graveyard. It enters, and Mike loses 7 life. Mike passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He recasts his commander, Kraum. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Kraum, Alex with his Beast, and Mike with Gilded Drake. They all take it, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 3 life and draws 3 cards through Tymna. He passes, discarding to hand size. Nabil draws and tasks Boseiju to help cast their commander, Tatiova, Benthic Druid. They play a Gemstone Caverns for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They activate Trade Routes, bouncing Gemstone Caverns back to their hand. They play Gemstone Caverns as their first Azusa land for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They play Oboro, Palace in the Clouds, as their second Azusa land. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They activate Trade Routes, bouncing Oboro back to their hand. They play Oboro as their final Azusa land for turn, then gain a life and draw a card through Tatiova. Nabil passes. Alex draws and casts Seedborn Muse. Alex passes the turn. Alex untaps with Mike through Seedborn. Mike draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Matt fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Kraum and Mike with Gilded Drake. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Matt pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Collector Oof. Oof is exiled, and Nabil gains 2 life. Next, Matt casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Hullbreaker Horror. He casts a Lotus Petal. Horror triggers, and he bounces Mana Crypt to his hand. Matt was ready to present a loop until Alex points out the Manglehorn on the battlefield. So Lotus Petal enters the battlefield tapped. Matt casts Mana Crypt. Horror triggers, bouncing Manglehorn back to Alex's hand. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, bouncing Mana Crypt back to his hand. He presents a loop of bouncing and recasting LED and Mana Crypt, netting infinite colorless mana. He casts the One Ring. Hullbreaker triggers, bouncing Mana Crypt. It enters, and he gains protection from everything. He presents another loop of drawing a card through the One Ring, bouncing it with Mana Crypt, and recasting it to draw another card. He draws his entire deck. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Swansong. He casts Arcane Signet. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Matt wins the game. Nick draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim and passes. Zach draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Lotus Petal. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Zach passes. Zeb draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Kraum Mox, imprinting Cabal Therapy. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Zeb ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts Esper Sentinel. Nick passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Tymna. Peter takes it and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Zach gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Lotho. Peter takes it and Zeb passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also pays to keep his Remora. He draws and casts Birds of Paradise. Peter passes the turn. Nick draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Zeb taps City of Brass to flash in an Archivist of Ogma. In response, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Archivist resolves, and then Nick fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Nick casts Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper and Peter with Avacyn's Pilgrim. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates 2 treasures. Nick ends his turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Tymna. Peter takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach loses a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Command Tower and passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Zeb casts Enlightened Tutor. Remora and Esper trigger, Zeb pays, then Peter draws. Then Zeb fetches up a Bolas's Citadel onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Archivist of Ogma as an additional cost. Mystic and Esper trigger, and both players draw. Then Zeb adds 4 black. He taps City of Brass to help cast Bolas's Citadel. Lotho and Remora trigger, Peter draws, then Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. With no answers, Bolas's Citadel resolves. Zeb pays a life to cast Serra Ascendant from the top of his library through Bolas's Citadel. He pays a life to cast Springleaf Drum through Citadel. Remora triggers and Peter draws. He pays 2 life to cast Demonic Tutor through Citadel, and Peter draws again. In response, Peter casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card targeting Demonic Tutor. Esper triggers and Nick draws. Then Demonic Tutor is countered and exiled. Next, Zeb pays a life to cast Mana Vault through Citadel, and Peter draws through Remora. He plays Takanuma, Abandoned Mire through Citadel as his land for turn. He pays 7 life to cast Peer into the Abyss. Remora triggers, and in response, Zach casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Peer. Remora and Esper trigger, and in response, Zeb pays 2 to cast Soul Partition through Citadel, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Peter draws. Remora is exiled, and still in response, Zeb pays 2 life to cast Fracture through Citadel, targeting Peter's Mana Crypt. Crypt is destroyed, then Zach pays for Esper, and then Peter draws from Remora. Then SWAT resolves, changing the target of Peer from Zeb to Zach. Then Peter draws from Remora, then Peer into the Abyss resolves. Zach loses half of his life and draws 44 cards. Zeb casts Orzhov's Signet. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Lotho. Zach takes it, and Zeb ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Kraum Mox. Esper triggers, and in response, Zach casts Snap, targeting Lotho. Esper triggers, and Nick draws again. In response, Peter casts Dark Ritual. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter flashes in, and Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, pings Lotho, killing it, and Peter amasses Orcs 1. Then Snap fizzles, and Nick draws from Esper. Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, and Peter amasses 1. Then Kraum Mox resolves, and Peter imprints Final Fortune. Next, Peter casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship. In response, Peter taps Mana Confluence to cast Demonic Consultation. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Consult. Then Fierce counters Wheel, and Peter passes the turn. Nick draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Esper triggers, Nick draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, then Peter amasses 1. Jetmir is countered, and Nick moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Facebreaker, Zeb with Sentinel, and Peter with Avacyn's Pilgrim. They all take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Nick casts Archon of Valor's Reach, naming instant as it enters. He casts Birds of Paradise, and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tymna. Zeb takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Bowmasters triggers, pings Zach, and Peter amasses 1. Zach plays a Plateau for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 9 treasures. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Zach creates 9 more treasures. He channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Archon back to Nick's hand. Zach casts Silence. Esper triggers, and Zach pays. Then Silence resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Zach casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Misty Rainforest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Sol Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Grim Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and then loses 3 life. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up another card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zach casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. Zach draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Zach passes. Peter draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes the turn. Chris draws and plays a Dwarven Ruins into play tapped. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Sandstone Needle into play tapped as well. Ryan passes. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Ristic Study. Esper triggers and Peter draws. Zach ships the turn. During his upkeep, Peter casts Enlightened Tutor. Ristic triggers and Zach draws a card. Then Peter fetches up a Mystic Remora onto the top of his library. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Mystic Remora. Ristic triggers and Zach draws. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper. Zach takes it and Peter passes. Chris draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He stares at 3 draw engines and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast a Mana Vault, paying for Ristic. Peter passes to Chris. Chris draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Goblin as it enters. He casts a Professional Facebreaker. Ristic triggers and Zach draws. Chris gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts Jessica's Will, targeting Zach. Remora, Esper, and Ristic trigger. Peter draws 2, and Zach draws 1. Jessica's Will resolves, and Ryan adds 9 red. He casts Grim Monolith, Mystic and Ristic trigger, and each player draws. He casts Manifold Key, and both draw again. He casts Basalt Monolith, and both draw again. He casts Wheel of Misfortune. Both players draw, then Wheel resolves. Each player secretly chooses a number, reveals them, then Ryan takes 5 damage, and Ryan discards his hand and draws 7. Next, Ryan plays a City of Traders. He casts a Sol Ring. Ristic and Remora trigger, Peter draws, and Ryan pays for Ristic. He casts an Arcane Signet, and both players draw. With nothing else, Ryan passes. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Tymna. Ryan takes it, and Zach gains 2. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Gamble. Remora and Esper trigger, and Peter draws 2. In response, Peter casts Pact of Negation. Ristic triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts a Pact of Negation of his own, targeting Peter's Pact. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. Pact counters Pact, and Gamble resolves. Zach fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Culling the Weak. He casts Silence. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Silence. Ristic triggers, and Zach draws a card. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Remora triggers, and Peter draws a card. With no other actions, Force counters Force, and Silence resolves. Zach casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. He casts an Ad Nauseam. He reveals a Windswept Heath, Phantasmal Image, Chrome Mox, Snap, Mana Confluence, Intuition, Mental Misstep, Mystic Remora, Misty Rainforest, Demonic Consultation, Windfall, Chain of Vapor, Scalding Tarn, Lion's Eye Diamond, Grim Tutor, Gemstone Caverns, Wheel of Fortune, Felwar Stone, Exotic Orchard, Arcane Signet, Vampiric Tutor, Diabolic Intent, Talisman of Progress, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Rite of Flame, Verdant Catacombs, and Address Town, deciding to stop there. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Fire Covenant. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts a Sol Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Sol Ring. It bounces. Zach sacks a land to continue the chain, bouncing Chrome Mox. He sacks a land and bounces Arcane Signet to his hand. He sacks a land, bouncing Ristic to his hand. He sacks his final land, bouncing Tymna to his hand, and stops the chain. He casts Sol Ring. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Dress Down. He casts Windfall. Each player discards their hand and draws 31 cards. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 9 treasures. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, Zach casts Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. But Defcat has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Plateau. Kevin draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a turn 1 Ristic Study. The table sighs, and Kevin passes. Kyle draws and plays a Forest. He casts an Elvish Mystic. Ristic triggers, and Kevin draws. Kyle passes. Defcat draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Serra Ascendant. Ristic triggers, and Kevin draws. He casts a Mystic Remora, and Kevin draws again. With nothing else, Defcat ships the turn. Catherine draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. Catherine passes. During his upkeep, Kevin wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Urza Saga as his land for turn, getting its first counter. He casts a Basalt Monolith. Remora triggers, and Defcat draws. Kevin ships the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and plays an island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Rhystic triggers and Kevin draws. He casts the Finehorn Elves, paying the Rhystic tax. Kyle ends his turn. During his upkeep, Deathcat pays to keep its Remora. He draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Kevin with Serra Ascendant. Kevin takes it, and Deathcat gains 6. Deathcat ends his turn. At the end of Deathcat's turn, Catherine casts an Enlightened Tutor. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Kevin and Deathcat draw. Then Catherine fetches up a Blind Obedience onto the top of her library. The turn moves to Catherine. Catherine draws and plays a Polluted Delta. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. She casts Blind Obedience. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Kevin and Deathcat draw. Obedience resolves, and Catherine passes to Kevin. During his upkeep, Kevin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays an island for turn. He casts his commander, Joyra, Weatherlight Captain, into play tap through Blind Obedience. He casts an Arcane Signet. Remora triggers, and Deathcat draws. Joyra triggers, and Kevin draws. Then Arcane Signet enters the battlefield tapped. He casts a Soul Ring, and both draw again. He casts a Voltaic Key, and both draw again. Unfortunately, since Blind Obedience makes all of its artifacts enter tapped, he is unable to continue and passes, discarding to hand size. Kyle draws and casts a Mox Amber. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Kyle pays for both. Amber enters tapped through Blind Obedience, and Kyle moves to combat. He attacks Deathcat with Kinnan. Deathcat takes it, and Kyle passes. At the end of Kyle's turn, Deathcat casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Blind Obedience, paying the Rhystic tax. Blind Obedience bounces, and Catherine doesn't continue the chain. The turn moves to Deathcat. During his upkeep, Deathcat casts Mystical Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Then Deathcat fetches up a Brain Freeze onto the top of his library. He lets his Mystic Remora die and draws for turn. He plays a Command Tower. He casts a Kraum Mox. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Kraum Mox resolves, and Deathcat imprints Tasha's Hideous Laughter. He casts Underworld Breach. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. In response, Kevin casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. In response, Deathcat casts Snapback for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Joyra. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws again. Joyra bounces, and still in response, Deathcat casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws again. With no other answers, Force of Will counters Underworld Breach. Deathcat moves to combat and attacks Kyle with Serra Ascendant. Kyle takes it, and Deathcat gains 6. With nothing else, Deathcat passes the turn. Catherine draws and plays a Mana Confluence. She casts Counterbalance. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Counterbalance resolves, and Catherine ends her turn. During his upkeep, Kevin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Kevin activates Saga, creating a construct. He then sacrifices Saga and fetches up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the battlefield. He activates Voltaic Key, untapping Basalt Monolith. He recasts Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. Counterbalance triggers, and Catherine reveals a Calamity's Wake. Then Joyra resolves. He casts Mox Opal. Joyra triggers, and Kevin draws. He casts Urza's Bauble and draws again. He casts Cloud Key and draws. It enters, and Kevin names artifacts. He casts Chromatic Sphere and draws a card. He casts Jeweled Lotus and draws again. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps it to cast Mystic Forge. Joyra triggers, and he draws. All through, Kevin passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Kyle casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Grafdigger's Cage. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Cage bounces, and Kevin doesn't continue the chain. Kevin discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Kyle. Kyle draws and casts a Brainstorm. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. Then Kyle draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He plays a Hinterland Harbor as his land for turn. He casts Worldly Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws again. Then Kyle fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Seedborn Muse onto the battlefield. Ready to get the ball rolling, Kyle gives the turn to Deathcat. Kyle untaps with Deathcat through Seedborn. Deathcat draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Windfall. Rhystic triggers, and Kevin draws. In response, Kyle casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Everyone knows that this game is now in real bad shape if this resolves, and discusses what to do next. Counterbalance triggers, and Catherine decides to ignore the trigger. In response, Kevin activates Mystic Forge, exiling the top card of his library. He also cracks his Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Urza's Bauble, looking at a random card in Kyle's hand. With nothing else, Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing opponents' non-land permanents. Then Windfall resolves, everyone discards their hand, and draws 21 cards. Deathcat casts Mox Opal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Rhystic Study. In response, Kyle casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Rhystic is countered, and Deathcat creates 2 treasures. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He casts a Malevolent Hermit. He casts Silence. In response, Catherine taps her Mana Confluence to cast Swan Song, targeting Silence. Esper triggers, and Deathcat draws. Silence is countered, and Deathcat creates a 2/2 bird. Next, he casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Malevolent Hermit as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Everyone discards their hands and draws 7. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Sea of Clouds. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Offer You Can't Refuse. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Underworld Breach in his graveyard. Underworld Breach returns to the battlefield, Savine's copies returning Lion's Eye Diamond to the battlefield. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He casts Benevolent Geist Force Disturb cost from his graveyard. He escapes LED 5 times, exiling 15 cards and cracking it each time for blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with a high enough storm count to mill out each opponent's library. Since all of his spells can't be countered, Brain Freeze resolves. Deathcat passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Deathcat wins the game. Kevin draws a card for turn and plays an Inventor's Fair. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Metal Worker. Kevin passes. Kyle draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Neoform. He casts an Incubation Druid and ends his turn. Deathcat draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Imperial Seal. Deathcat ends his turn. Catherine draws and plays an Ottawara, Soaring City as her land for turn. She casts a Mana Vault. She casts an Azorius Signet. She casts a Cursed Totem. Kyle sinks his head as Catherine ends her turn. During his upkeep, Kevin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it and taps his Fiery Islet to help cast his commander, Joyra, Weatherlight Captain. He casts a Lotus Petal. Joyra triggers and he draws. He casts a Mishra's Bauble and draws again. He casts a Mana Vault and draws a card. He casts an Ensnaring Bridge. Joyra triggers and, in response, Deathcat cracks his Lotus Petal to help cast Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Kevin draws and Ensnaring Bridge resolves. He cracks his Mishra's Bauble looking at the top card of Deathcat's library. With no other actions, he passes the turn. During Kyle's upkeep, Kevin draws through Mishra's Bauble. Kyle draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps his Spire of Industry and Waterlogged Grove to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Llanowar Elves and ships the turn to Deathcat. Deathcat draws and exiles a Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts a turn 2 Underworld Breach. With no answers, Breach resolves. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze from his graveyard with all copies targeting himself, milling 9. He escapes LED again and cracks it for 3 more blue. He escapes Brain Freeze again, milling 15. He escapes LED and cracks it for 3 black. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Deathcat wins the game. But Mike has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mana Confluence. Cal draws a card for turn and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He sacrifices Lotus Petal to help cast Manamorphose, adding a red and a green and drawing a card. He casts his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. It enters and Cal creates a Boo token. He activates Minsc and Boo's first ability, putting 3+1/+1 counters onto Boo. Cal moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Boo. Brandon takes the hit and Cal passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Simic Signet. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Hullbreaker Horror. He casts a Rhystic Study. Mike ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Soul Ring and Mike draws through Rhystic. He casts an Arcane Signet and Mike draws again. He casts a Jeweled Lotus, paying the Rhystic tax. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mana Crypt and Mike draws through Rhystic. Cruz passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Cruz, tapping Ancient Tomb to help pay for Rhystic. In response, Cruz casts Vampiric Tutor, paying the Rhystic tax. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Jessica's Will resolves and Cal adds 4 red and then exiles Shatter Skull Smashing, Beseiju Who Endures, and Mana Crypt off of the top of his library. He casts Mana Crypt from exile, paying for Rhystic. He casts Haze of Rage with buyback and Mike draws through Rhystic. In response to the Storm trigger, Cal casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Rhystic Study, paying the Rhystic tax. Rhystic is destroyed and Haze of Rage and its copies resolve, and Cal returns it to his hand through buyback. Cal moves to combat, attacking Mike with Boo. Mike declares no blocks and takes the damage. In his second main phase, Cal activates Minsc and Boo's second ability, sacrificing Boo, dealing 9 damage to Brandon and drawing 9 cards. He casts a Mox Amber. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts an Orcish Lumberjack. All through, Cal passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Felwar Stone. He activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, failing to find. Mike ships his turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Cal. He fetches up a card from Cal's library into exile face down. He casts Cal's Dockside Extortionist from exile through Praetor's Grasp. It enters, and he creates 9 treasures. Brandon sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He casts his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Minsc and Boo with Kraum, killing the Planeswalker. In his second main phase, Brandon casts Tainted Pact. He exiles cards from the top of his library until he reveals an Ad Nauseam into his hand. With nothing else, he passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, creating 12 treasures. Cruz casts his commander, Will the Wise. Kraum triggers and Brandon draws. Will enters, Cal and Mike each make a clue, Brandon declines and loses a life, and then Cruz creates 3 clues. He pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting Vampiric Tutor in his graveyard, putting it on top of his library. He sacrifices the clue and draws a card. He casts Vampiric Tutor, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and losing 2 life. He cracks another clue and draws a card. He then casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, exiling Kennen. Cruz casts Emil the Blessed. Seeing an infinite mana loop in his future, Brandon responds by casting Demonic Consultation, naming Mindbreak Trap as it resolves. He exiles the top 6 and then exiles until he reveals Mindbreak Trap, putting it into his hand. He casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Emil. Crisis averted, the table can breathe again. Cruz casts Fiend Artisan. He gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Ruby Medallion. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to outcast his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. Kraum triggers and Brandon draws. Minsc and Boo enter, and Cal creates a Boo token. He activates Minsc and Boo's first ability, putting 3/1/1 counters onto Boo. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Boo, and Brandon takes the damage. In his second main phase, Cal casts Talisman of Impulse. He sacrifices a clue and draws a card, then passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws and recasts his commander, Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. He activates Kennen, looking at the top 5, but fails again to find a creature. Dejected, he ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Ad Nauseam. It resolves, and Brandon reveals the Simian Spirit Guide, Mox Diamond, Tundra, Savine's Reclamation, Imperial Seal, Culling the Weak, Pact of Negation, Windswept Teeth, Spell Pierce, Felwar Stone, Underground Sea, Otawara Soaring City, Mistcast, Talisman of Indulgence, Mana Crypt, Esper Sentinel, March of Swirling Mist, and a Cyclonic Rift, deciding to stop there. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Windswept Teeth. Brandon moves to combat and attacks Cal with Kraum. Cal takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays 1 life and draws 1 card through Tymna, going down to 2 life. He casts Calling the Weak, sacrificing Kraum as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Felwar Stone. He pushes his chips into the middle of the table and casts Final Fortune. He casts Talisman of Indulgence. Brandon moves to his next turn, discarding the hand size. Brandon draws and casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He moves to combat and attacks Minsc and Boo with Tymna. Cal declares no box, and Minsc and Boo take 2. Then Brandon gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Brandon casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He hard cashed Taxian Probe. He looks at Cruz's hand and draws a card. He casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Minsc and Boo. Brandon holds priority and casts Pact of Negation, targeting his own Cyclonic Rift. He continues to hold priority and casts Spell Pierce, countering his own pact. Rift resolves and bounces Minsc and Boo back to Cal's hand. Now, with everyone wondering why he just did all that, he casts Brain Freeze with a much higher storm count, with all copies targeting himself. With the storm count being high enough, Brandon mills out the rest of his deck. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond to help flash back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Thassa's Oracle in his graveyard. Savine's resolves, creating a copy that targets Ranger Captain of Eos, but none of that really matters as Thassa's Oracle has entered the battlefield. Oracle puts a win the game trigger onto the stack, and the table looks at each other for an answer. But with none to be found, Brandon wins the game. Drake draws for turn and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. He passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts a Mox Amber. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Diabolic Intent. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Cabal Ritual. He cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. With his explosive turn 1 done, he ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Godless Shrine onto the battlefield tapped. He ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and plays a sad Gemstone Caverns. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Bergi, God of Storytelling. He ships the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Will the Wise. Will enters, and Brandon and Drake lose 1 life, and Ashani creates a clue, and Cruz creates 2 clues. He ships the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Ashani channels Otawara Soaring City, bouncing Bergi back to Drake's hand. Drake draws and plays a Shattered Skull to hammer pass and to play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts a Mind Goblin. He puts a Misunderstood sticker on it and adds 4 red. He recasts his commander, Bergi, God of Storytelling. He casts a Mana Vault, triggering Bergi and Mystic Remora. Brandon draws a card and Drake adds a red. He casts Wheel of Misfortune, triggering Bergi and Remora. Brandon draws and Drake adds another red. In response, Cruz casts Deli Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Bergi. Brandon draws and Bergi is exiled. Still in response to Wheel, Brandon casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Wheel of Misfortune. Unfortunately for Drake, Mindbreak Trap resolves, exiling Wheel. Drake activates his Sensei's Divining Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and casts a Talisman of Dominance. Remora triggers and Brandon draws. He casts Final Fortune and Brandon draws again. Final Fortune resolves and Ashani moves to his extra turn. Ashani draws and casts Ad Nauseam. Remora triggers and Brandon draws. In response, Brandon casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Ad Nauseam. Force of Will resolves and Ad Naus is countered. Unfortunately, this was Ashani's only out, so Ashani ends his turn and loses the game. Cruz draws and plays a Scrubland. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Will. Brandon takes it and Cruz passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Brandon casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Mana Crypt onto the top of his library. During his upkeep, Brandon lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks his Jewel Lotus to help cast his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Combat and attacks Cruz with Kraum. Cruz takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Brandon casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Drake activates his top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Then Dockside enters, and Brandon creates 3 treasures. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He ships the turn to Drake. During his draw step, Drake takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he plays a Command Beacon. He casts Aether Flux Reservoir. He passes to Cruz. At the end of Drake's turn, Cruz casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Kraum. In response, Brandon casts Swan Song, targeting Red Blast. Swan Song counters REB, and Cruz creates a 2/2 bird. Still in the end step, Cruz casts Eladamri's Call. Kraum triggers and Brandon draws. Eladamri's Call resolves, and Cruz fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos into his hand. The turn moves to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger Captain resolves, and Cruz fetches up a Viscera Seer into his hand. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Kraum. Drake takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Dress Down. He ships the turn. During his draw step, Drake takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Aetherflux Reservoir triggers, and Drake gains a life. He spends the top, and then gives the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Badlands. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with his bird. Brandon takes it, and in his second main phase, he casts his commander, Max the Daredevil. He passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Brandon casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Drake flips his top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Still in response, Cruz cracks a clue, drawing a card. Rift resolves, bouncing all non-land permanents Cruz and Drake control. The turn moves to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Underground Sea. He moves to combat, attacking Cruz with Kraum and Drake with Tymna. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Peer into the Abyss. He draws half of the cards in his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Final Fortune. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to his extra turn. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle resolves, and in response to the trigger, he casts Tainted Pact. He exiles his library, putting Culling the Weak into his hand. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Brandon wins the game. Alan draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Assassin's Trophy. He taps the City of Brass to cast a Tinderwall. All set up, he passes the turn. Jay draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Verdant Catacombs. He ships the turn to Travis. Travis draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He gives the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and plays an island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a forest. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Lotus Petal. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Jay. He looks at Jay's hand and draws a card. He passes. At the end of Kevin's turn, Alan casts a Worldly Tutor. In response, Jay casts Swan Song. Tutor is countered, and Alan creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to Alan. Alan draws and plays an Undergrowth Stadium. He sacrifices his Tinder Wall, adding 2 red. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Corvold, Vakeur's King. Corvold enters, Alan sacrifices his bird, Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Alan draws. He passes the turn. Jay draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Jay creates 6 treasures. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Combat and attacks Travis with Kraum. Travis takes it, and Jay ships the turn. Travis draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts a Training Grounds. Kraum triggers and Jay draws. In response, Kevin pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Training Grounds. Jay passes the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Vonder Prodigy. He casts a Mystic Remora. Kraum triggers and Jay draws. Remora resolves and Kevin ends his turn. Alan draws and plays a Spire Garden. He casts a Dark Confidant. He passes to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He taps it to help cast his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Kraum and Kevin with Dockside. He holds priority and casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Kinnan. Kinnan is exiled and Kevin gains 2 life. Then they both take it, and in his second main phase, Jay pays 2 and draws 2 through Tymna. Feeling good, Jay ends his turn. Travis draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, he ships the turn to Kevin. During his upkeep, Kevin pays to keep his Remora. He draws and cracks his Lotus Petal to help recast his commander, Kinnan. Kevin passes. During his upkeep, Alan reveals a Demonic Tutor through Dark Confidant. He draws and casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Dark Confidant as an additional cost. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Alan draws a card. He fetches up a card into his hand. He taps the City of Brass to cast Dockside Extortionist. Kraum triggers and Jay draws. Dockside enters and, in response, Travis taps his Mana Confluence to cast Chain of Vapor, targeting Corvold. Remora triggers and Kevin draws. Corvold bounces and Alan doesn't continue the chain. Dockside enters and Alan creates 7 treasures. He casts Demonic Tutor. Mystic triggers and Kevin draws. Alan fetches up a card into his hand and then gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alan with Kraum, Kevin with Tymna, and Travis with Dockside. Travis blocks with Thrasios, they all take the rest, and then Jay gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He plays a Morphic Pool for turn. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. In response, Travis activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Gamble into his hand. In response, Alan casts Ad Nauseam. Remora triggers and Kevin draws. In response, Jay casts Miscast and Kevin draws again. With nothing else, Ad Naus is countered and Mnemonic Betrayal resolves. Each opponent then exiles their graveyards. Jay exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Demonic Tutor from exile. Remora triggers and Kevin draws. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach and Kevin draws from Remora. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond and Kevin draws again. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling some of his library. He escapes Chain of Vapor, targeting his Dockside. Remora triggers and Kevin draws. Dockside bounces and he doesn't continue the chain. He escapes LED and Kevin draws again. He cracks it for 3 red. He escapes Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Jay creates 5 treasures. He escapes Brain Freeze and Kevin draws. He mills more of his library. He escapes Chain of Vapor, bouncing Dockside, and Kevin draws through Remora. He casts Dockside, creating 5 treasures. He escapes Grand Abolisher. It resolves, locking out opponents this turn. Jay casts Chain of Vapor from exile, bouncing Dockside. He recasts Dockside, creating 5 more treasures. He presents a loop of escaping LED, cracking it for blue, then escaping Brain Freeze, milling out his opponents. He passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. One by one, each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Jay wins the game. Jay draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. Daquan draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Mana Vault. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and pays 2 life to cast Ataxian Probe, targeting Catherine. He looks at Catherine's hand and draws a card. He plays a Tundra for turn. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide, adding a red, and casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He gives the turn to Catherine. Catherine draws and casts a Lotus Petal. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She passes to Jay. During Jay's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He gives the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Culling Ritual. In response, Zach casts Swan Song. Culling Ritual is countered, Catherine thanks Zach, and Daquan creates a 2/2 bird. Next, Daquan casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Ragavan. Daquan ships the turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jay with Ragavan. Jay takes it, Ragavan triggers, and Jay exiles a Witchclaw Talisman, and then Zach creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Zach casts a Witchclaw Talisman from exile. He passes to Catherine. Catherine draws, takes no game actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Jay creates 3 treasures. He casts Ad Nauseam. Without a fight, Ad Nauseam resolves. Jay reveals a Chrome Mox, Enlightened Tutor, Jeweled Lotus, Vampiric Tutor, Scrubland, Marsh Flats, Mental Misstep, Esper Sentinel, Badlands, Brain Freeze, Culling the Weak, Drannith Magistrate, Swords to Plowshares, Simian Spirit Guide, Underground Sea, Ancient Tomb, Arid Mesa, Dark Ritual, Talisman of Progress, Luxury Suite, Windswept Heath, Time Twister, Wooded Foothills, Demonic Consultation, Spell Pierce, Savine's Reclamation, Mystical Tutor, Scalding Tarn, Silence, Cabal Ritual, Morphic Pool, and a Felwar Stone, deciding to stop there. He casts Calling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He plays an Underground Sea for turn. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Peer into the Abyss. Peer resolves, Jay draws half of his remaining library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Tundra. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Time Twister. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Catherine cracks her Lotus Petal for a red and then casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Thassa's Oracle, which was the first blue spell of the turn. In response, Jay casts Pact of Negation, countering Red Elemental Blast. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Jay casts Demonic Consultation. He names You Are Already Dead and exiles his library. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Jay wins the game. Sean draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Soul Ring and passes. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast an Arcane Signet. He ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Snow-Covered Swamp. He casts a Mana Crypt and ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts his commander, Yoshimaru Ever Faithful. He gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean casts an Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Rhystic Study onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Rhystic Study. He ends the turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Ranger Captain of Eos, paying for Rhystic. Ranger Captain enters, and Zach fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He passes to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Verdict Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Prosper Tomebound, and Sean draws through Rhystic. Cal moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles a Jewel Lotus. Cal ships the turn. Charles draws and plays an Aganjo Castle. Yoshimaru triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Charles moves to combat and attacks Sean with Yoshi. Sean takes it, and in his second main phase, Charles casts Drannith Magistrate. Rhystic triggers and Sean draws. Charles passes. Sean draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 3. He fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos onto the battlefield. Ranger Captain enters, and Sean fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts Esper Sentinel. Rhystic triggers, and Zach taps his Ancient Tomb to pay for it. In response, Sean pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Esper Sentinel. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. He casts Dothy Voidwalker, paying for Rhystic. Cal moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles Magda, Brazen Outlaw. Cal ships the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Gaia Reach Sanitarium. Yoshimaru triggers and gets a counter. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Yoshi. Sean takes it, and in his second main phase, Charles casts a Null Rod, paying for Rhystic. The table sighs, and Charles gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Esper Sentinel. He moves to combat, attacking Charles with Ranger Captain. Charles takes it, and Sean passes. Zach draws and casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic and Esper trigger, and Zach taps his Ancient Tomb to pay for both. Zach adds 3 black, and Dark Ritual is exiled under Dothy with a Void counter. He casts a Grim Tutor, and Sean draws through Rhystic. He fetches up a card into his hand, loses 3 life, and Grim Tutor is exiled under Dothy. He gives the turn to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dothy as an additional cost. Cal pays for Rhystic, and Sean draws through Esper. He adds 4 black. He casts Baleful Mastery for its alternate cost, targeting Drannith, paying the Rhystic tax. Drannith is exiled, and Charles draws through Mastery. Next, Cal casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw through Prosper. Prosper triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. Cal moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles a Thoughtseize. He ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Yoshimaru. Sean takes it, and in his second main phase, Charles casts March of Otherworldly Light, exiling a white card, targeting Rhystic, paying for Rhystic and Esper. In response, Sean casts Soul Partition, targeting his own Rhystic Study. Rhystic is exiled, and March fizzles. Charles passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Sean casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Zach's Ranger Captain. In response, Zach sacks his Ranger Captain, locking out his opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Bolt fizzles, and Charles passes the turn. Sean draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Rhystic Study from exile through Soul Partition. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Ranger Captain. Charles takes the hit, and Sean gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and pays 2 life to cast Ataxian Probe, targeting Sean. Esper and Rhystic trigger, and Sean draws 2. Then Zach looks at Sean's hand and draws a card. Zach taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Toxic Deluge where X equals 4, paying 4 life. Rhystic triggers, and Sean draws. In response, Sean sacks his Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then all creatures get -4/-4, wiping the board. With the board now cleared, Zach passes to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Reanimate, targeting Esper Sentinel and paying the Rhystic tax. Esper enters, and Cal loses a life. He casts Thoughtseize, targeting Sean, paying for Rhystic. Sean reveals his hand and discards Eladamri's Call, and Cal loses 2 life. Cal ships the turn. Charles draws and plays a snow-covered plains. He casts Serra Ascendant, paying for Rhystic. He casts his commander, Keleth, Sunmane Familiar, paying for Rhystic again. He ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a breeding pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He ships the turn. Zach draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Cal loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper Sentinel. Zach takes it, and Cal ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a War Room. He attacks Sean with Serra Ascendant and Zach with Keleth. Keleth triggers, and Charles puts a 1/1 counter onto itself. Both players take it, and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, he recasts Yoshimaru, paying for Rhystic. Charles passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Sean activates Thrasios. He scries 1 and reveals an Aven Mind Sensor into his hand. The turn moves to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora, and Cal draws through Sentinel. Sean gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws, takes no actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Cal loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a command tower. He recasts his commander, Prosper, and Sean draws through Rhystic. Cal moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles Sensei's Divining Top. The turn moves to Charles. Charles draws and moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Keleth and the Ascendant and Zach with Yoshi. Keleth triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Both players declare no blocks, and in response, Charles flashes in a Sigarda's Vanguard, paying for Rhystic. In response, Sean casts Delay, paying for Esper. Vanguard is countered and exiled with 3-time counters on it. Then they all take it, and Charles gains 6 life. Charles passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Sean casts Intuition, targeting Zach. He fetches up a Devoted Druid, Swift Reconfiguration, and Sabine's Reclamation. Zach gives him the Devoted Druid, and the turn moves to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Emergence Zone. He casts Wargate, where X equals 5, and Cal draws through Esper. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Wargate. Esper and Rhystic trigger, and Zach taps his Ancient Tomb to pay for Rhystic. Cal draws through Esper, and then Force of Will resolves, countering Wargate. Sean moves through his steps and phases, and in response, Zach casts Enlightened Tutor, paying for Rhystic. He fetches up a Lion's Eye Diamond onto the top of his library. Sean gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts a Lion's Eye Diamond, paying for Rhystic and Esper. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cal loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Sensei's Divining Top from exile through Prosper. Prosper and Rhystic trigger, Sean draws, and Cal creates a treasure. Next, Cal casts a Braid, targeting Null Rod, and Sean draws through Rhystic. Null Rod is destroyed, and then Cal casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Esper Sentinel as an additional cost. Rhystic triggers, and Sean draws. Cal fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Grinding Station, paying for Rhystic. He plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Underworld Breach, and Sean draws. In response, Charles evokes Solitude, exiling a white card. Rhystic triggers, and Sean draws again. Solitude enters and exiles Prosper, then Charles sacrifices Solitude. Still in response to Breach, Zach casts Silence, paying for Rhystic. In response, Cal casts Reign of Filth, and Sean draws. He sacrifices Gemstone Caverns through Reign of Filth, adding a black. He activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He sacrifices a Snow-Covered Mountain to cast Entomb. Sean draws through Rhystic, and then Cal fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his graveyard. He sacks a Snow-Covered Swamp, adds a black, and spends his top again. With no other responses, Silence resolves, and a very sad Underworld Breach resolves. Unable to cast any spells, Cal moves to his end step, sacrificing Underworld Breach. During his upkeep, Charles removes a time counter from Sigarda's Vanguard. He draws and casts Umizawa's Jitte. Yoshimaru and Rhystic trigger, Sean draws, and Yoshimaru gets a counter. Charles equips Jitte to Yoshi. He attacks Sean with everything, triggering Keleth, giving itself a counter. Sean takes it all, dies, and Charles gains 6. Jitte triggers and gets 2 counters. In his second main phase, he casts Sanctifier in Vec. Sanctifier resolves, exiling all black and red cards in graveyards. He passes to Zach. Zach draws and casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Underworld Breach. He casts Demonic Consultation. He holds priority and sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. Consult resolves, and Zach names Brain Freeze. He exiles the top 6, and then exiles until he finds Brain Freeze, putting it into his hand. He casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. He mills 12 cards. He escapes LED. He escapes Brain Freeze, targeting himself again. He mills 21 cards. He sacks his LED, adding 3 blue. He escapes LED and sacks it, adding 3 white. He escapes Silence, locking out his opponents this turn. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Zach wins the game. Charles draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts a Deafening Silence. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Deafening Silence. Charles passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Savannah. He casts a Springleaf Drum. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Otawara, Soaring City. He cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Time Twister. He casts Mystic Remora. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. With nothing else, Zach ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Skirk Prospector. Cal passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Sarah Ascendant. He casts his commander, Yoshimaru Ever Faithful. He ships his turn. Sean draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Thrasios Triton Hero. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Zach pays for his Remora. He draws, casts a Mana Vault, and passes. Cal draws and plays the City of Traders. He sacrifices Skirk Prospector, adding a red. He casts his commander, Prosper Tomebound. Cal moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and he exiles a Praetor's Grasp. He gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays the Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Stony Silence. Mystic Remora triggers, and in response, Zach cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. Zach then draws from Remora. Still in response, Sean activates Springleaf Drum, tapping down his Thrasios, adding a blue. Then Stony Silence resolves, and Charles moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Sarah Ascendant and Sean with Yoshi. They both take it, and Charles gains 6 life. All done, Charles ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Draneth Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Thrasios. Zach takes it, and Sean passes. During his upkeep, Zach lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Watery Grave into play tapped. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and casts a Grinding Station. He plays a Badlands, sacrificing his City of Traders. He casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles an Imperial Seal. Cal ships his turn. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Myrel, Shield of Argive. Yoshimaru triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Yoshi and Cal with Sarah Ascendant. They both take it, and Charles gains 6 life. He passes to Sean. Sean draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it and Mana Confluence to help cast his commander, Bruce Tarl, Boorish Herder. Bruce triggers, and Sean gives Thrasios lifelink and double strike until the end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Thrasios. Zach takes 2, and Sean gains 2. Sean ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Windfall. Everyone discards their hand and draws 5. Zach passes. Cal draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Necropotence. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Magda. Magda triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Cal activates Necropotence 8 times, paying 8 life, exiling 8 cards. He moves to his end step, putting the Necro cards into his hand. Prosper triggers, and he exiles Bergi, God of Storytelling. Cal passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Path to Exile, targeting Prosper. Prosper is exiled, and Cal fetches up a Snow-Covered Swamp onto the battlefield tapped. Charles moves to combat and attacks Cal with Myrel and Zach with everything else. Myrel triggers, creating 3 soldiers. Then they both take it, and Charles gains 6. In his second main phase, Charles casts a Vryn Wingmare. Charles gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Bruise. Bruise triggers, giving himself double strike and lifelink. Charles takes 6, and Sean gains 6 life. In his second main phase, he taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to cast Seedborn Muse. He ends his turn. Sean untaps with Zach through Seedborn. Zach draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He does nothing else and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Sean taps his Mana Confluence to activate Thrasios. He scries 1 and reveals a Lightning Bolt into his hand. The turn moves to Cal. Sean untaps with Cal through Seedborn. Cal skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He plays a Phyrexian Tower as his land for turn. He taps his City of Brass to cast Chandra, Torch of Defiance. In response, Sean taps his Mana Confluence to activate Thrasios. He scries 1 and reveals a Swift Reconfiguration into his hand. Chandra resolves, and Cal activates her third ability, dealing 4 damage to Seedborn, killing it. Cal moves to combat and attacks Zach with Magda. Magda triggers, creating a treasure. Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Cal activates Necropotence 2 times, paying 2 life, exiling 2 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the exiled cards into his hand. Cal passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts March of Otherworldly Light, where X equals 3, exiling Sean's Thrasios. He casts Cathar Commando. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Sarah Ascendant, Myrel, Yoshi, and Wingmare, and attacks Chandra with a soldier. Zach takes it all, and Chandra dies. Charles gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and moves to combat. He attacks Charles with Bruise, giving itself lifelink and double strike. Charles blocks with a soldier, and Sean gains 3. In his second main phase, he casts Finehorn Elves. He taps his City of Brass and Mana Confluence to recast his commander, Thrasios. Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Zach cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Zach flashes in a Dress Down. It enters, he draws a card, and then the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Stony Silence. Chain resolves, Stony Silence bounces, and Charles sacrifices a land, copying the chain, targeting Dress Down. Dress Down bounces, Zach sacks a land, continues the chain, targeting his Mana Vault. He He floats mana from his rocks, then Mana Vault bounces. He sacks a land, copying the chain, bouncing Mox Diamond, and then decides to stop there. Zach recasts Dress Down. It enters and he draws a card. He recasts Mana Vault. He recasts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Brass. He casts Silence. In response, Sean casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Zach. Zach takes 3 and Silence resolves. Zach exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts an Underworld Breach. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond from his graveyard since Dranith is shut off through Dress Down. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Brain Freeze. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. He mills 24 cards. He demonstrates a loop of using LED to escape Brain Freeze, milling his entire library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. He holds priority and escapes Swords to Plowshares, exiling Dranith. He then escapes Chain of Vapor, targeting his Dress Down. Dress Down bounces, then Thassa's Oracle resolves, and Zach wins the game. Beth draws a card for turn and plays a snow-covered forest. She casts Exploration. She plays a forest as her Exploration land for turn. She casts a Jiraga Tree Speaker. Beth passes. Cal draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Jeweled Lotus and passes to Claire. Claire draws and plays a Spire of Industry. She casts a Jeweled Lotus. She casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Chain of Vapor. She cracks her Lotus to help cast her commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. She moves to Crombat and attacks Cal with Kraum. Cal takes it and Claire ends her turn. Noah draws and plays a Tundra. He casts a Soul Ring and ends his turn. Beth draws and plays a Swamp. She casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. She casts her commander, the Gitrog monster. She casts Scheming Symmetry, targeting Noah. Both her and Noah fetch up a card onto the top of their libraries. Beth ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws, plays a Sunken Ruins, and passes. Claire draws and plays an Underground Sea. She moves to combat and attacks Beth with Kraum. Beth takes it and Claire gives the turn to Noah. Noah draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays an Ottawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts Rhystic Study. Kraum triggers and Claire draws. In response, Cal taps his Mana Confluence and sacks his Jeweled Lotus to flash in his commander, Nimrus, Una's Trickster. Rhystic resolves and Noah passes. During her upkeep, Beth sacrifices a forest to Gitrog. Gitrog triggers and Beth draws. She draws for turn and levels up Jiraga Tree Speaker. She moves to combat and attacks Claire with the Gitrog monster. Claire takes it, and in her second main phase, Beth plays a Dakmor Salvage into play tapped. Beth gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and taps his Mana Confluence to cast Felwar Stone. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws. Cal passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Claire casts Snapback, targeting the Gitrog monster, paying the Rhystic tax. Gitrog bounces, and the turn moves to Claire. Claire draws and plays a Morphic Pool. She taps her Spire of Industry to cast her other commander, Tymna the Weaver. She moves to combat and attacks Beth with Kraum. Beth takes it, and in her second main phase, Claire pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. All through, Claire passes. During his upkeep, Noah wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Kraum. He moves to combat and attacks Claire with Kraum. Claire takes it, and Noah ships the turn to Beth. Beth draws and casts Arcane Signet, paying the Rhystic tax. She casts Ashes to Ashes, targeting both Kraums. Both Kraums, Rhystic Study, and Phantasmal Image all trigger. Noah sacrifices his Kraum, Noah draws through Rhystic, and then Claire and Noah draw through Kraum. In response, Claire casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Ashes to Ashes. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws. In response, Cal casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Swat. Nimrus triggers, Cal looks at the top 2, putting Muddle the Mixture into his graveyard. Then Offer counters Swat, and Claire creates 2 treasures. Then the other Kraum is exiled, and Beth takes 5 damage. With nothing else, Beth passes. Cal draws, holds open mana, and passes. Claire draws and moves to combat. She attacks Noah with Tymna. Noah takes it, and Claire gains 2 life. In her second main phase, she pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. She plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps her Spire of Industry to cast Gamble. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws. Then Claire fetches up a card into her hand and then randomly discards a Diabolic Intent. She casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws. In response, Cal taps his Mana Confluence to cast Frantic Search. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws again. Nimrus triggers, Cal looks at the top 2, putting Chrome Mox into his graveyard. Then Frantic Search resolves, Cal draws 2, discards 2, and untaps up to 3 lands. Unfortunately, no one has any answers, and Ad Nauseam resolves. Claire reveals a Ledger Shredder, March of Swirling Mist, Luxury Suite, Plateau, an Offer You Can't Refuse, Mystical Tutor, Ancient Tomb, Imperial Seal, Swan Song, Polluted Delta, Mana Crypt, Scrubland, Wishclaw Talisman, Blood Crypt, Reel of Fortune, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Simian Spirit Guide, Dothy Voidwalker, Underworld Breach, and a Reign of Filth, deciding to stop there. She casts Reign of Filth, and Noah draws through Rhystic. She casts a Mana Crypt, and Noah draws again. She sacks her Morphic Pool for a black through Reign of Filth to help cast Wishclaw Talisman, paying the Rhystic tax. She activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into her hand and giving Wishclaw to Cal. She exiles Simian Spirit Guide from her hand, adding a red. She sacks 2 lands to help cast Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Claire creates 7 treasures. She casts Underworld Breach, and Noah draws through Rhystic. She escapes Gamble and Noah draws again. She fetches up a card into her hand and then randomly discards Mystical Tutor. She casts Silence and Noah draws through Ristic. In response, Cal casts Cyclonic Rift targeting Underworld Breach. Ristic triggers and, in response, Noah casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Silence of his own onto the top of his library. Then Ristic resolves and Noah draws. Noah then taps his City of Brass to cast Silence. In response, Claire casts Miscast targeting Silence. Ristic triggers and Noah draws. Miscast resolves, countering Noah's Silence. With Cyclonic Rift still on the stack, Claire casts Swan Song. Rift is countered and Cal creates a 2/2 bird. With no other answers, Claire's Silence resolves, locking out opponents to the stern. Claire escapes Gamble, randomly discarding Wheel of Fortune. She casts Lion's Eye Diamond. She sacks it, discards her hand, and adds 3 blue. She escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting herself, milling her library. She escapes Lion's Eye Diamond again and sacks it for 3 more blue. She escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Claire wins the game. Well, that was an awesome game. But Jay has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling a Bayou. Matt draws a card for turn and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring and passes the turn. Kyle draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora, then ships the turn to Pearson. Pearson draws and plays a Watery Grave, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring of his own. Mystic Remora triggers, and in response, Jay exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He flashes in a turn 0 Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, pings Kyle, and Jay amasses Orcs 1. Remora's trigger resolves and Kyle draws. Bowmasters triggers, Jay pings Kyle and amasses 1. Then Soul Ring resolves. Next, Pearson casts a Talisman of Creativity. Remora triggers, Kyle draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Pearson, and Jay amasses 1. Talisman resolves, and Pearson ends his turn. Jay draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He casts Mystic Remora. Kyle's Remora triggers and he draws. Bowmasters triggers, Jay pings Pearson and amasses 1. Jay's Remora resolves and he moves to combat. He attacks Pearson with Bowmasters and Kyle with the army. Both players take it and Jay ships the turn. Matt draws and plays a Watery Grave, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Ristic Study, triggering both Remoras. Kyle and Jay draw, Bowmasters triggers, pings Pearson, and Jay amasses 1. Matt passes to Kyle. During its upkeep, Kyle pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He gives the turn to Pearson. Pearson draws and plays an Undercity Sewers. It enters and he surveils a City of Traders into his graveyard. He casts his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, paying for Ristic. He passes. During his upkeep, Jay pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Bowmasters and Najeela, and Kyle with the army. Najeela triggers and Jay creates a warrior tapped and attacking Matt. Matt and Kyle take the hit, and Jay ships the turn. Matt draws and pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. The table knows what this is going to enter as a copy of, which is Jay's Bowmasters. Jay wants to make a deal saying that they can control the table if they let each other's Bowmasters live. Matt agrees, and Metamorph resolves. It enters as a copy of Bowmasters. It triggers, and the table discusses what they should deal with on the board. The table agrees that Malcolm is the biggest threat, so Matt pings Pearson and amasses 1. He gives the turn to Kyle. At the end of Matt's turn, Kyle casts Path to Exile, targeting Jay's Bowmasters. Mystic and Ristic trigger, Jay draws, Matt Bowmasters triggers, pings Malcolm, and Matt amasses 1. Then Matt draws, Jay's Bowmasters triggers, pings Malcolm, killing it, and Jay amasses 1. With Path still on the stack, Jay taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Snap, targeting his Bowmasters. Remora and Ristic trigger, Kyle draws, both Bowmasters triggers, Matt and Jay each ping Pearson and amass 1. Then Matt draws through Ristic, Snap resolves, bouncing Bowmaster, and Jay untaps 2 lands. Then Path to Exile fizzles, and the turn moves to Kyle. During its upkeep, Kyle pays to keep his Remora. He draws, plays an Underground Sea, and passes. Pearson draws and taps his Talisman to help cast a Mayhem Devil. Ristic triggers, and in response, Jay flashes in his Orcish Bowmasters. Ristic triggers, and Matt draws. Bowmasters enters, pings Pearson, and Jay amasses 1. Pearson then pays for Ristic, Mayhem Devil resolves, and Pearson ships the turn. During its upkeep, Jay taps his Ancient Tomb to help pay for his Remora. He draws and casts Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Ristic triggers, Matt draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Pearson, and Jay amasses 1. Derevi enters, targeting Command Tower. In response, Matt casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Derevi. Both Remoras trigger. Kyle draws, both Bowmasters triggers, Jay and Matt each ping Pearson and amass 1. Then Jay draws through Remora and Matt's Bowmasters triggers. He pings Kyle and amasses 1 as well. With no other responses, Swords exiles Derevi and Jay gains 2 life. Jay moves to combat and attacks Pearson with the army and Kyle with everything else. Najeela triggers twice and Jay creates 2 warriors tapped and attacking Kyle. Pearson and Kyle take it all and Jay passes to Matt. Matt draws and casts an Arcane Signet. Both Remoras trigger, Jay draws, Bowmasters triggers, pings Kyle, and Matt amasses. Then Kyle draws and both Bowmasters trigger. Jay and Matt each ping Kyle and amass 1. Arcane Signet resolves and Matt gives the turn to Kyle. During his upkeep, Kyle lets his Remora die. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Jay's Bowmasters, killing it. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Ranger Captain of Eos, and Matt draws through Rhystic. Ranger Captain enters, and Kyle fetches up a Mockingbird into his hand. He casts Mockingbird where X equals 0, and Matt draws again. It enters as a warrior. The table scratches their head a bit, and Kyle passes, discarding to hand size. Pearson draws and casts Kite Sail Larcenous, paying for Rhystic. Larcenous enters, turning both armies and Ranger Captain into treasures. He plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. He cracks it and pays a life. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Bowmasters, killing it. He then fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Pearson ships the turn. During his upkeep, Jay taps his Ancient Tomb to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it and pays a life. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging one of his warriors, killing it. Jay then fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos, and Matt draws through Rhystic. Ranger Captain enters, and Jay fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Chrome Mox, and Matt draws again. Chrome Mox enters, imprinting Wild Growth. He cracks his army treasure to help cast Esper Sentinel, paying for Rhystic. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging another warrior, killing it. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Najeela and a warrior. Najeela triggers twice, and Jay creates 2 warriors attacking Matt. In response, Matt casts Snap, targeting Jay's Ranger Captain. Remora and Esper trigger, and Jay draws 2 cards. Snap bounces Ranger Captain, and Matt untaps 2 lands. Then Matt takes the hit, and Jay passes the turn. At the end of Jay's turn, Matt flashes in an Opposition Agent. Matt draws and plays a Minamo, School at Water's Edge. He sacrifices his army treasure for a black. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Opposition Agent. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. Remora and Esper trigger, and Jay draws 2 cards. Matt activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Jay. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and in response, Matt casts Tainted Pact. Remora triggers, and Jay draws. In response, Kyle casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Tainted Pact. Remora, Esper, and Rhystic all trigger. Matt draws, and Jay draws 2. In response, Matt casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Trap. Remora triggers, and Jay draws again. In response, Kyle casts a Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Tainted Pact. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Matt and Jay draw. With no other answers, Force exiles Tainted Pact, Force counters Trap, then Thoracle's trigger resolves. Matt looks at the top 3, puts 1 on top and the rest on bottom. With his win attempt stopped, he gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and casts a Lotus Petal. Remora, Esper, and Rhystic trigger, Matt draws, and Jay draws 2. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver, and Matt draws again. He moves to combat and attacks Jay with Mockingbird. Jay takes it, and in his second main phase, Kyle pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He ships the turn. At the end of Kyle's turn, Pearson flashes in a Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws. The turn moves to Pearson. Pearson draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Pirate as it enters. He taps it to help cast his commander, Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, paying for Rhystic. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Alluring Scoundrel and Jay with Kite Sail Larcenous. Both players take it, Keen-Eyed Navigator triggers twice, and Alluring Scoundrel triggers. He puts a counter on Scoundrel, then draws and discards a Lion's Eye Diamond. He then creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, he casts Ragabed, Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay's Remora triggers. In response, he casts Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Opposition Agent. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws. In response, Pearson cracks a treasure for a red. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Esper Sentinel, killing it. Pearson casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Deadly Rollick. Remora and Rhystic trigger, he pays for Rhystic, and Jay draws through Remora. In response, Jay casts a Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Fierce. May draws through Rhystic, then Force counters Fierce, and Rollick exiles Opposition Agent. Then, he finally lets his Remora die, Mayhem Devil triggers, and pings Najeela. He draws and activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Matt. He casts Lotus Petal, and Matt draws through Rhystic. He recasts his Ranger Captain of Eos, and Matt draws again. In response, Kyle cracks his Lotus Petal for a red. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Najeela, killing her. Kyle casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Ranger Captain. In response, Jay casts Pact of Negation, targeting Force. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws. In response, Kyle casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws again. In response, Jay pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Red Elemental Blast. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws. Finally stepping in, Matt pays 2 life to cast his own Mental Misstep, targeting Misstep. In response, Jay casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Misstep. In response, Kyle casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws a card. In response, Jay casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting all of its opponent's spells. Rhystic triggers, and Matt draws again. In response, Matt casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Mindbreak Trap. With nothing else, Force counters and exiles Trap, Swat redirects Pact to Swat itself, Flusterstorm counters Misstep, Misstep counters Blast, Pact of Negation fizzles, and finally, Force of Will counters Ranger Captain. Next, Jay casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and in response, Jay cracks his Lotus Petal to help cast a Tainted Pact. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Thoracle. In response, Matt casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Tainted Pact. After all of that, Jay does the silly little Thoracle Scry thing and gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and plays Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He taps it to help cast an uncounterable Grand Abolisher. With no answers left, Abolisher resolves, locking out opponents. Matt casts Mox Diamond, discarding an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts his commander, Tivit, Seller of Secrets. It enters, and Matt creates 2 treasures and 3 clues. He casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Mayhem Devil. He casts Time Sieve. He activates Time Sieve, sacrificing his newly created artifacts to get an extra turn. He presents a loop of taking extra turns with Tivit, creating 5 treasures, and sacrificing them to Time Sieve. He does this over and over, spreading out the attacks each turn. Once each player is about to take lethal commander damage, he casts an additional artifact to help pay for the extra artifact costs. He then takes 3 more turns, taking out each player one by one to commander damage, and Matt wins the game. Ian draws and plays a Takanuma Abandoned Mire for turn. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Talion the Kindly Lord. Talion enters and Ian names 2. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Soul Ring and ends his turn. Sasha draws and plays a Flooded Strand. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. She casts Gamble. She fetches up a card into her hand and then randomly discards a Wishclaw Talisman. She casts a Mana Crypt. She casts a Mox Opal. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Rogoth. All through, she passes the turn. Corey draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He ends his turn. Ian draws and casts a Soul Ring. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Obnixilis, Captive Kingpin. He gives the turn to Sasha. During her upkeep, Sasha wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and casts a Talisman of Creativity. Talion triggers, Sasha loses 2 life, and Ian draws a card. She casts Vampiric Tutor. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. She passes. At the end of Sasha's turn, Corey casts a Vampiric Tutor. In response, Sasha casts a Swan Song. Corey is shocked as Swan Song counters Vampiric Tutor, and he creates a 2/2 bird. The turn moves to Corey. Corey draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Talisman of Dominance. Talion triggers, Corey loses 2 life, and Ian draws a card. He casts a Mana Vault. Corey passes. Ian draws and casts Spellskite. He misses his land drop and passes, discarding to hand size. Ryan draws and casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Grape Shot, with each copy targeting his opponents. Talion triggers, Ryan loses 2 life, and Ian draws. In response, Ian pays 2 life to activate Spellskite, redirecting Grape Shot to Spellskite itself. Then Corey and Sasha take 1, and Obnixilis triggers twice. Ob gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Vampiric Tutor. With the Obnixilis trigger still in the stack, Ryan casts Vampiric Tutor from exile. In response, Ian pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Tutor. Then Obnixilis gets another counter, and Ryan exiles a Coruscation Mage. He moves to combat and attacks Sasha with Obnixilis. She takes 6, and in his second main phase, Ryan casts Grinding Station. He ships the turn. During her upkeep, Sasha wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and casts Rhystic Study. In response, Ian casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, countering, and exiling Rhystic. Sasha passes. Corey draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Combat and attacks Sasha with Kraum and his bird. She takes it, and Corey gives the turn to Ian. Ian draws and sinks his head as he missed his land drop again. He casts Weathered Runestone. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Talion. Corey takes it, and Ian passes. Ryan draws and casts a Mox Amber. He moves to combat and attacks Ian with Obnixilis. Ian takes it, and Ryan passes. During her upkeep, Sasha loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. She draws and casts Springleaf Drum. She casts her other commander, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. Kraum and Talion trigger, Sasha loses 2, Ian draws, then Corey draws from Kraum. Sasha ends her turn. During his draw step, Corey takes a damage from his Mana Vault. Obnixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Mana Confluence. In his main phase, he plays the Spire of Industry. He casts Mox Opal. He casts his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Sasha with Kraum and Ryan with his bird. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Corey pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts a Lotus Petal. Corey passes. Ian draws and plays an Ottawa, Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts Bloodchief's Ascension. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Talion. Ryan takes it, Ian moves to his end step, puts a counter onto Bloodchief's Ascension, and passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Mana Confluence from exile as his land for turn. He casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Talion. In response, Ian casts Misdirection for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card. It resolves, and Ian redirects Red Blast to Kraum. Kraum is destroyed, and Ryan follows up by casting Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Talion. In response, Ian pays 2 life to activate Spellskite, redirecting Rollick to Spellskite itself. Spellskite is exiled, and Ryan taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Wheel of Fortune. In response, Corey casts Snap, targeting Obnixilis. Talion triggers, Corey loses 2, and Ian draws a card. Then Obnixilis is bounced, and Corey untaps 2 lands. Still in response, Corey casts Mystical Tutor. In response, Ian casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering Tutor. With Wheel still in the stack, Ryan cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. Then each player discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Ryan casts Disciple of the Vault. He casts Skirk Prospector. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Sasha casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Talion. Talion bounces, and the turn moves to Sasha. During her upkeep, Sasha wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She casts Grim Monolith. She casts Grim Tutor. She holds priority and casts Flare of Duplication for its alternate cost, sacrificing Rograk as an additional cost. Then Grim Tutor is copied. Tutor resolves, Sasha fetches up a card into her hand and loses 3 life. Then she fetches up another card into her hand and loses another 3 life. Sasha casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and she creates 6 treasures. She cracks a treasure for a black. Disciple of the Vault triggers and Sasha loses a life. She casts Tainted Pact. She exiles her entire library, putting the last card into her hand. She cracks another treasure, losing 1 from Disciple to help cast Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Sasha wins the game. Chad draws and plays a Hedge Maze. It enters, and Chad surveils, leaving it on top. He passes. Philip draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Power Balance. Philip passes. Corey draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Lotus Petal. Power Balance triggers, and Philip reveals an Eternal Scourge. Corey casts a Felwar Stone and ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel. Ryan ships the turn. Chad draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts Delighted Halfling. He casts a Soul Ring. Esper triggers and Ryan draws. Chad gives the turn to Philip. Philip draws, plays a Spire Garden, and passes. Corey draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Power Balance triggers and Philip reveals a Pyroblast. Corey ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays an Adakar Waste. He casts Arcane Signet. Ryan passes the turn. Chad draws and casts his commander, Nadu Winged Wisdom. Chad passes to Philip. Philip draws, takes no actions, and passes. Corey draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Philip with Tymna. Philip takes it, and Corey gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Corey pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, paying the Esper tax. Corey ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts Grim Monolith. Power Balance triggers, and Philip reveals a Wheel of Fortune. Ryan passes. Chad draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. At the end of Chad's turn, Philip casts Pyroblast, targeting Nadu, paying for Esper. Nadu triggers, and Chad reveals a Vernant Catacombs onto the battlefield. In response, Chad casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing Hedge Maze as an additional cost, paying for Esper. After a lot of deliberation from the table, Crop Rotation resolves. Chad fetches up a Talon Gates of Madar onto the battlefield. It enters and targets Nadu. Nadu triggers, and Chad reveals a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. Then Nadu phases out, Pyroblast fizzles, and the turn moves to Philip. Philip draws, takes no actions, and passes. Corey draws and moves to combat. He attacks Chad with Tymna. Chad takes it, and Corey gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Corey pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. Corey ships the turn. Ryan draws and casts Displacer Kitten. In response, Chad casts Pact of Negation. Esper triggers, and Chad pays. In response, Ryan casts Orum's Chant, targeting Corey, locking him out of spells this turn. Then Ryan casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Pact of Negation. Unfortunately for Ryan, he forgot about Delighted Halfling on the table. So in response, Chad cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Then Chad pays for all Flusterstorm, and Pact counters Displacer Kitten. With nothing else, Ryan passes to Chad. Before untaps, Chad's Nadu faces back in. During his upkeep, Chad pays for Pact of Negation. He draws and casts an Arbor Elf. Chad ships the turn. Philip draws and plays the Gaia's Cradle. He passes. Corey draws and moves to combat. He attacks Philip with Tymna. He takes it, and Corey gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Badlands for turn. He casts Tainted Pact. Esper and Power Balance triggers, Philip reveals a Tinderwall, then Ryan draws a card. Pact resolves, and Corey exiles until he reveals an Underworld Breach, putting it into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. In response, Ryan casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card. In response, Corey casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Force. Fierce counters Force, and Underworld Breach resolves. Corey cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He escapes Tainted Pact, exiling until he reveals a Brain Freeze, putting it into his hand. He casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 18. He escapes LED. He cracks it for 3 blue. He presents a loop of escaping Brain Freeze, milling his opponents, and escaping LED for more mana. He does this over and over, milling 6 of his own library to help pay for the escape costs and milling everyone else out. He escapes Wheel of Fortune. Each opponent attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Corey wins the game. Before Game 3, Ryan has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Snapcaster Mage. Philip draws and plays the Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Vexing Shusher. Philip passes. Corey draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Corey passes. At the end of Corey's turn, Ryan casts a turn 0 Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Time Twister onto the battlefield. Ryan draws and plays a Plains. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Time Twister. In response, Philip casts Lightning Bolt, dealing 3 to Ryan. Then each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their libraries and draws 7. Finished up, Ryan passes. Chad draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Arbor Elf and passes. Philip draws and plays a Carplusian Forest. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Tinderwall. He casts a Destiny Spinner. He casts his commander, Roxanne, Starfall Savant. It enters and Philip creates a Meteorite. It enters, killing Arbor Elf. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Ragavan. Corey takes it, Philip creates a treasure, and Corey exiles a Mox Diamond off of the top of his library. Philip passes the turn. Corey draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Arcane Signet. He cracks Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Deflecting Swat. He casts Mystic Remora. Corey ships the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays an island. He casts Ristic Study. Remora triggers and Corey draws. Ryan casts Spellskite. Ryan gives the turn to Chad. Chad draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Wizard as it enters. Chad passes. During his upkeep, Philip wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Roxanne and Corey with Ragavan. Roxanne triggers and Philip creates a Meteorite. Meteorite enters and hits Chad for 2. Then Ryan and Corey take it, Ragavan triggers, Philip creates a treasure, and Corey exiles a Tundra. In his second main phase, Philip casts Orcish Lumberjack. Ristic triggers and Ryan draws. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 4. Mystic and Ristic trigger, and in response, Philip flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. Ristic triggers and Philip pays. Dualcaster resolves and copies Finale of Devastation. Then Philip fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. It enters and Philip creates 5 treasures. Philip then pays for Ristic, Corey draws through Mystic, and the original Finale resolves. Philip fetches up a Temur Sabertooth onto the battlefield. He activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Dockside to his hand. He recasts Dockside, creating 5 more treasures. He presents a loop of bouncing and recasting Dockside through Temur Sabertooth, paying for Ristic each time, creating infinite treasures. He activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing and recasting Roxanne over and over. When Roxanne enters, Philip creates a Meteorite, pinging each opponent over and over until they are dead, and Philip wins the game. Ryan draws a card for turn, plays a Tundra, and passes. Chad draws and plays an island. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Nadu, Winged Wisdom. The table starts to sweat as Chad passes. Philip draws and plays a Taiga. He casts an Arbor Elf and ends his turn. Corey draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer. He passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Frantic Search. He draws 2, discards 2, and untaps his lands. He taps Ancient Tomb again to cast an Arcane Signet. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Heliod the Radiant Dawn. It resolves, and Ryan ships the turn to Chad. Chad draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts Concordant Crossroads. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Seeker of Skybreak. Everyone knows that this is 8 cards per rotation with Nadu, so in response, Ryan casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Seeker. In response, Chad casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Mindbreak Trap. In response, Ryan casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Force. Fierce counters Force, and Trap exiles Seeker. The table breathes a sigh of relief as Chad passes to Philip. At the end of Chad's turn, Philip taps Arbor Elf, since it now has haste through Concordant Crossroads, to untap his Taiga. He casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Philip. Philip draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Wild Growth. He casts Destiny Spinner. He activates Arbor Elf, untapping his Taiga. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Philip creates 3 treasures. All through, Philip ends his turn. Corey draws and asks the table if they would let him connect with his Ragavan. No one agrees, and Corey moves to combat. He decides to risk it and attacks Ryan with Ragavan. Ryan blocks, Ragavan dies, and Corey ends his turn. Ryan draws and moves to combat, attacking Chad with Heliod. Chad takes it, and in his second main phase, Ryan taps his Ancient Tomb and pays 2 life to activate Heliod, transforming it into Heliod the Warped Eclipse. Ryan gives the turn to Chad. Chad draws and plays a Mishra's Factory. He activates Mishra's Factory, turning it into a creature. He activates its second ability, targeting itself. Nadu triggers, and Chad reveals an Ancient Tomb onto the battlefield. Chad passes. Philip draws and casts his commander, Roxanne, Starfall Savant. It enters, Philip creates a Meteorite, dealing 2 to Ryan as it enters. Next, Philip casts Temur Sabertooth. It resolves, and Philip passes. Corey draws and plays a Spire of Industry. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Corey ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He holds open mana and passes. Chad draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help bestow Springheart Nantuko, targeting Nadu. Nadu triggers, and Chad reveals a Cephalid Colosseum onto the battlefield. All through, Chad passes. Philip draws and activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Dockside to his hand. He recasts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Chad activates Mishra's Factory, turning it into a creature. He activates Factory's second ability, targeting itself. Nadu triggers, and Chad reveals an Arbor Elf into his hand. It enters, and Philip creates 5 treasures. He sacks a treasure for 2 green through Roxanne to activate Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Dockside to his hand. He recasts Dockside. In response, Ryan cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps Ancient Tomb to flash in a coveted jewel. In response, Corey flashes in an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, targeting Destiny Spinner. In response, Philip casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting the ability. It resolves, redirecting the ability to Bowmasters itself. Bowmasters dies and Corey amasses 1. Then Coveted Jewel resolves and Ryan draws 3. Unfortunately, he couldn't find what he needed and Dockside resolves. It enters and Philip creates 7 treasures. Philip presents a loop of continually bouncing and recasting Dockside, creating infinite treasures. Philip presents another loop of bouncing and recasting Roxanne, creating meteorites, burning out the table, and Philip wins the game. Before they begin, Alex has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mirage Mirror. Nabil draws and plays a snow-covered forest. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays a forest. He casts his commander, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. Alex passes. Mike draws and plays an underground sea. He ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Humid as it enters. He casts a Lotus Petal and ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays an Oboro, Palace in the Clouds as their land for turn. They cast 3 visits. In response, Matt cracks his petal to cast Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He taps Cavern of Souls to flash in an uncounterable Opposition Agent. Agent resolves, then Matt fetches up a tropical island from Nabil's library into exile. Nabil passes. Alex draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Opposition Agent. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kinnan. Mike takes it, and Alex gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Training Center. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Each player discards their hand and draws 7. He casts a Mox Opal. Mike ends his turn. Matt draws and plays a Tropical Island from exile through Opposition Agent. He casts a Mana Vault. He passes. Nabil draws and casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Veil of Summer. They cast a Lotus Cobra. They play an island and pass the turn. Alex draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts the One Ring. It enters and Alex gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. He casts Seedborn Muse. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding a City of Traders. Finished up, Alex passes. Alex untaps with Mike through Seedborn. Mike draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Alex activates Kinnan. In response, Mike casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Seedborn Muse. In response, Alex activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. Then Seedborn is bounced and Kinnan's ability resolves. Alex looks at the top 5, putting Allosaurus Shepherd onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He passes. Nabil draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. Lotus Cobra triggers and Nabil adds a green. They cast their commander, Tatiova Benthic Druid. Nabil ships the turn. At the end of Nabil's turn, Alex activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, failing to find. During his upkeep, Alex loses 2 life to the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge as his land for turn. He casts Terrastodon. It enters and Alex destroys all of Matt's lands. Matt then creates 3 3/3 elephants. Next, Alex pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Terrastodon. It enters and destroys all 3 of Mike's lands. Then Mike creates 3 elephants. He casts a Mox Amber. He recasts Seedborn Muse. Alex passes. Alex untaps with Mike through Seedborn. Mike draws and plays a Watery Grave into play tapped. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Alex activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing 4. He activates Manamo, untapping the One Ring. He activates the One Ring, adding another counter and drawing 5. The table agrees that there isn't really anything anyone can do, concede, and Alex wins the game. Before they begin, Matt has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Savine's Reclamation. Alex draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mind Stone. He casts a Mirage Mirror. After a blazing turn 1 done, Alex passes. Mike draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Talisman of Dominance. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Mike passes the turn. Matt draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Ragavan as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He exiles Simeon's Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Ad Nauseam. He reveals a March of Swirling Mist, Exotic Orchard, Final Fortune, Otawara Soaring City, Brain Freeze, Toxic Deluge, Ranger Captain of Eos, Sea of Clouds, Dark Ritual, Misty Rainforest, Plateau, Opposition Agent, Mindbreak Trap, Hallowed Fountain, Pyroblast, Felwar Stone, Scrubland, Angel's Grace, Rite of Flame, Flusterstorm, Mana Vault, Phantasmal Image, Intuition, Swords to Plowshares, Wishclaw Talisman, and Talion the Kindly Lord, deciding to stop there. Unfortunately, he did not flip into 1 piece of fast mana, and unfortunately has to pass, discarding the hand size. Nabil draws and plays an island. They cast a Soul Ring. Nabil passes. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Alchemist's Refuge. He activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of Rejuvenating Springs. He casts his commander, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his talisman to help cast his commander, Kraum Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Krombat and attacks Mike with Kraum. Matt takes it and dies. Mike ships the turn. Nabil draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. They cast Azusa, Lost but Seeking. In response, Alex activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Kraum. Nabil plays an island as their Azusa land for turn, and play a Homeward Path as their second Azusa land. Nabil ends their turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Mike's Talisman. He taps his Talisman to help cast a Whir of Invention where X equals 3. In response, Nabil hard casts Force of Negation. In response, Alex activates Mind Stone, sacrificing it, drawing a card. Then Force counters and exiles Whir. Alex passes the turn. Mike draws and taps his Talisman to help cast a Rhystic Study. Mike passes. Nabil draws and casts a Mana Vault, paying for Rhystic. They cast their commander, Tatiova, Benthic Druid. Kraum triggers and Mike draws. They play a Waterlogged Grove for turn. Tatiova triggers and they gain a life and draw a card. Nabil ships the turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts As Foretold, paying for Rhystic. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Kraum. Alex takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Toxic Deluge where X equals 3, paying 3 life. All creatures get -3/-3, and Mike passes to Nabil. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage from their Mana Vault. They recast their commander, Tatiova. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Nabil plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. Tatiova triggers and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. They crack Scalding Tarn, pay a life, and fetch up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Tatiova triggers and Nabil gains a life and draws another card. Nabil ends their turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also puts a counter onto As Foretold. He draws and casts Llanowar Elves for free through As Foretold, paying the Rhystic tax. He activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Rejuvenating Springs. He recasts his commander, Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. Rhystic and Kraum trigger, and Mike draws 2. Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Mike flashes in an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, kills Llanowar Elves, and Mike amasses Orcs 1. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Brass. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Kraum. Alex takes it, and Mike passes to Nabil. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. They cast Collector Roof, paying for Rhystic. Nabil ships the turn. At the end of Nabil's turn, Alex casts Worldly Tutor for free through As Foretold. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Then Alex fetches up a Birds of Paradise onto the top of his library. Still in the end step, Mike casts Red Elemental Blast, destroying Kennen. The turn moves to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also puts a counter onto As Foretold. He draws and casts Phantasmal Image for free through As Foretold, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Mike casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card. In response, Alex casts Veil of Summer. Rhystic and Kraum triggers, and Mike draws 2. In response, Mike taps City of Brass to cast Swan Song, targeting Veil. Veil is countered, Alex creates a 2/2 bird, then Force counters Femage. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He passes. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage from Mana Vault. They take no actions and pass the turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also puts a counter onto As Foretold. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Birds of Paradise for free through As Foretold, paying for Rhystic. Alex ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Kraum. Alex takes it, and Mike passes. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. They play a Gemstone Caverns for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. Bowmasters triggers, Mike kills Birds of Paradise, and Mike amasses 1. Nabil passes. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also adds a counter to As Foretold. He draws and plays Gemstone Caverns. He casts Kennen for free through As Foretold, paying the Commander tax. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Alex passes the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Mike casts Tainted Pact. He exiles from the top of his library until he exiles a Mystic Remora, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mystic Remora. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Kraum. Alex takes it, and Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Nabil casts an Overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Rift. The turn moves to Nabil. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. In their main phase, they cast Capture of Jing Xiao. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. Then Nabil gains an extra turn. Nabil taps Waterlogged Grove to cast Trade Routes. Mystic, Rhystic, and Kraum trigger, and Mike draws 3 cards. Trade Routes resolves, and Nabil passes the turn to himself. During their upkeep, Nabil pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting Azusa in their graveyard. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and in response, Mike casts Mystical Tutor. In response, Nabil pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Mystic, Rhystic, and Kraum trigger, and Mike draws 3 cards. Then Misstep counters Tutor, Mike draws from Rhystic and Mystic, and Nabil puts Azusa onto the top of his library. During their draw step, Nabil takes a damage through Mana Vault. They cast Azusa, Lost but Seeking, paying for Rhystic. In response, Mike casts Pact of Negation. In response, Nabil casts Swan Song. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. Swan Song counters Pact, Mike creates a 2/2 bird, and still in response, Mike casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Azusa. Nabil activates Trade Routes, bouncing an island back to their hand. They play an island for turn. Tatiova triggers, and Nabil gains a life and draws a card. Bowmasters triggers, pings Collector Roof, and Mike amasses 1. Finished up, Nabil passes. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also adds a counter to As Foretold. He draws and casts a Mox Opal. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Mike draws 2. Alex passes. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Diabolic Intent, sacrificing his Orc army as an additional cost, fetching up a card into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Kraum. Alex takes lethal commander damage and dies. In his second main phase, Mike casts Underworld Breach. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Necropotence. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Collector Oof. Oof bounces, and Nabil stops the chain. Mike taps his Talisman to help cast Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. He mills 18 cards. He escapes Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Mike creates 3 treasures. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 24. Mike escapes Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Kraum as an additional cost, fetching up a card into his hand. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks it, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes LED again, then cracks it for 3 more blue. He escapes Narset, Parter of Veils. He casts Thassa's Oracle. In response, Nabil cracks Waterlogged Grove, drawing a card. Oracle enters, and with a devotion of 5 and 5 left in his library, Mike wins the game. Peter draws a card for turn and plays a Savannah. He casts a Noble Hierarch and passes. Nick draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts an Avacyn's Pilgrim. Nick passes. Zach draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Wheel of Fortune. He holds priority, sacrifices LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Wheel of Fortune. Next, he casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Unfortunately disrupted, and with no cards in hand, Zach ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts Serra Ascendant. Zeb ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Rhystic Study. Peter ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Sunbaked Canyon. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. He casts Sardian Avenger. Peter draws through Rhystic, and Nick passes the turn. Zach draws and casts his other commander, Kraum Ludovic's Opus. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. Zach moves to combat and attacks Peter with Tymna and Nick with Kraum. They both take it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. Zach ships the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. He casts his commander, Lotho Corrupt Sheriff. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. Zeb moves to combat and attacks Peter with Serra Ascendant. Peter takes it, and Zeb gains 6 life. Zeb passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter casts a Witchclaw Talisman and passes the turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Nick flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. The turn moves to Nick. During his upkeep, Nick wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He taps Silent Clearing to help cast Sanctum Prelate. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws a card. Sanctum enters, and Nick names 1. He casts Boromir, Warden of the Tower. Lotho and Rhystic trigger, Peter draws, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nick moves to combat and attacks Zach with Sardian Avenger. Zach takes 8, and Nick ships the turn. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tymna. Zeb takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts a Talisman of Creativity, paying for Rhystic. Zach ends his turn. Zeb draws, takes no actions, and passes. Peter draws and plays a Taiga. He casts Elad Domri's Call. In response, Zeb cracks a treasure to flash in an Archivist of Ogma. Sardian Avenger triggers, and Zeb loses a life. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Snap, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Mind Sensor is bounced, and Peter untaps 2 lands. Then Peter fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Zeb cracks 2 treasures to help cast Abeyance. Lotho and Sardian Avenger triggers, Zeb loses 2, and then loses 1 more and creates a treasure. In response, Peter exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Zeb. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Abeyance resolves, and Zeb draws another card. Then Dockside resolves. It triggers, and in response, Zeb cracks his treasure. Sardian Avenger triggers, and Zeb loses a life. Then Peter creates 6 treasures. Peter casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. He cracks 5 treasures, loses through life through Avenger, and then casts his commander, Kenrith the Return King. With nothing else, Peter passes to Nick. During Nick's upkeep, his Mana Crypt triggers. In response, Peter cracks 2 treasures to cast Final Fortune. Zardian Avenger triggers, and Peter loses 2 life. Then Nick loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers, and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. He taps Sunbaked Canyon to help cast his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Rhystic triggers, and Peter draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Sardian Avenger. Avenger triggers, and in response, Peter cracks a treasure. Avenger triggers, and Peter loses a life. Then Avenger gets +9/+0. Peter blocks with Phantasmal Image. Image dies, and the turn moves to Peter. Peter draws and exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Nick flashes in and Avon Mind Sensor. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Avon resolves, then Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7 cards. Next, Peter casts Underworld Reach. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Peter escapes Snap, targeting Sardian Avenger. Sardian bounces and Peter untaps 2 lands. He escapes Snap again, targeting Avon Mind Sensor. Sensor bounces and Peter untaps 2 lands again. He casts Mana Crypt. Boromir triggers and counters the spell. He casts Lotus Petal and it gets countered by Boromir again. Now, Peter has enough cards in his graveyard, so he escapes Wheel of Fortune. In response, Zach taps his Talisman to cast Snap, targeting Sanctum Prelate. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. Sanctum bounces and Zach untaps 2 lands. Still in response, Zach casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Wheel. Lotho and Rhystic trigger, Zach pays, then Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Archivist of Ogma triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Then Flusterstorm counters Wheel of Fortune. Next, Peter escapes Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside. In response, Zeb cracks his treasures. Then Peter creates 6 treasures of his own. He plays a Tarnished Citadel for turn. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost. In response, Zeb casts Reprieve. Rhystic triggers and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Swan Song. Reprieve is countered, Zeb creates a 2/2 bird, then Evolution resolves. Peter fetches up a Displacer Kitten onto the battlefield. Archivist triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Peter casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 0. Displacer Kitten triggers and flickers Dockside, then Peter creates 6 more treasures. Then Finale resolves and Peter fails to find. Archivist triggers and Zeb gains a life and draws a card. Next, Peter escapes Wheel of Fortune. Displacer Kitten triggers, Peter flickers Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. Then everyone discards their hand, with Peter discarding Thassa's Oracle, and then draws 7. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Peter declines to search. He cracks Ranger Captain, locking out opponents this turn. He casts Gamble. Displacer Kitten flickers Dockside, and Peter creates 6 more treasures. He fetches up a card into his hand, and then randomly discards a Tainted Pact. He casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Kraum. Displacer Kitten flickers Dockside, Peter creates 6 treasures, and Kraum is destroyed. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and in response, he escapes Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Peter wins the game. But Brendan has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mox Opal. Chris draws a card for turn and plays a mountain. He casts Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. Chris passes. Mike draws and plays a snow-covered island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding snow-covered forest. He casts his commander, Kennen Bonder Prodigy. In response, Brendan casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Rhystic Study onto the top of his library. Kennen resolves, and Mike casts Crow Mox, imprinting Gilded Drake. He casts Mox Opal. He casts a Green Sun Zenith where X equals 3. In response, Brendan casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Green Sun Zenith. All through, Mike ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Brandon passes to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Chrome Mox. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. Chrome Mox resolves and Alana imprints Time Twister. She casts an Arcane Signet and Brandon draws again. She casts a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer and Brandon draws again. Alana ships the turn. Chris draws, plays a Mountain, and passes. Mike draws, plays an Exotic Orchard, and also passes. Brandon draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast the One Ring. It enters, and Brandon gains protection from everything. Brandon activates the One Ring. In response, Mike activates Kennen. He looks at the top 5, putting a Tidespell Tyrant onto the battlefield. Then Brandon adds a Burden counter and draws a card. Brandon ships the turn. Alana draws and moves to combat. She attacks Chris with Ragavan. Chris takes it, Ragavan triggers, Alana creates a treasure, and Chris exiles a mountain off of the top of his library. In her second main phase, she casts Rhystic Study. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga, and Brandon draws again. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Chris casts Pyrokinesis for its alternate cost, exiling a red card, targeting Kennen, Rograk, and Ragavan, paying for both Rhystics. They all die, and the turn moves to Chris. Chris draws and dashes in a Ragavan. Both Rhystics trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Chris creates a treasure, and Alana exiles Calling the Weak. Chris passes, and Ragavan returns to his hand. Mike draws and plays a forest. He casts Flesh Duplicate. Tidespell triggers, and Mike bounces Mox Opal to his hand. Both Rhystics trigger, and Alana and Brandon draw. Flesh Duplicate enters as a copy of Tidespout Tyrant. He casts Mox Opal, 2 Tidespouts and both Rhystics trigger. Mike pays for both Rhystics, then the Tidespout spawns Alana's Rhystic and Mike's Chrome Mox. He casts Chrome Mox, 2 Tidespouts and Rhystic trigger. Mike pays for Rhystic, then the Tidespouts bounce Brandon's Rhystic and Mike's Mox Opal. Chrome Mox enters and Mike doesn't imprint. Mike presents a loop of casting each artifact, bouncing the other, and bouncing an opponent's permanent. He does this over and over until everyone's permanents are bounced. Unfortunately, he cannot tap these artifacts for mana due to their restrictions, so Mike moves to combat and attacks Alana with Tidespout. Alana takes it, and Mike ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Underground Sea. He passes, discarding to hand size. Alana draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. She taps it to cast an Arcane Signet. She casts a Kraum Mox imprinting Yawgmoth's Will. She passes. Chris draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mountain. Chris passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Alana casts Snap, targeting Tidespout Tyrant. Tidespout bounces and Alana untaps her Ancient Tomb and Chris's Mountain in order to ensure everyone has interaction for Mike's turn. Still in the end step, Chris casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Mike's other Tidespout. Tidespout is destroyed and the turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and casts Kraum Mox imprinting Nyx's Bloom Ancient. He recasts his commander, Kinnan. Mike chips the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Brandon ends his turn. Alana draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps Ancient Tomb to recast Rhystic Study. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. She recasts her commander, Rograk, and Brandon draws again. Alana passes the turn. Chris draws and casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw. Chris ends his turn. Mike draws and casts Basalt Monolith. Rhystic's trigger and Alana and Brandon draw. In response, Brandon casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws a card. Basalt is countered and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Kinnan. Brandon takes it and Mike passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Drannith Magistrate, paying for Rhystic. Brandon chips the turn. Alana draws and plays a Badlands. She taps Ancient Tomb to cast Talisman of Indulgence. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. Alana passes. Chris draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Chris creates a treasure, and Alana exiles a Swan Song. Chris passes. Mike draws, holds open mana, and passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast the One Ring. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. It enters and Brandon gains protection from everything. Brandon passes to Alana. Alana draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. She taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Windfall. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. In response, Brandon casts Swan Song. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. In response, Alana casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing Watery Grave, targeting Swan Song. Rhystic triggers and, in response, Chris casts Pyroblast, targeting Windfall. Both Rhystics trigger and both players draw. In response, Alana casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Pyroblast. Rhystic Study triggers and Brandon draws a card. In response, Brandon activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. With nothing else, Force counters Pyroblast, Brandon draws from Rhystic, Daze counters Swan Song, and with Windfall still in the stack, Alana casts Cabal Ritual. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws a card. Alana adds 3 black, and with Windfall still in the stack, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting an Elvish Spirit Guide onto the battlefield. Still in response, Mike casts Swan Song, targeting Windfall. Both Rhystics trigger, Mike pays for Alana's, and Brandon draws a card. Then Swan Song counters Windfall, and Alana creates a 2/2 burn. Next, Alana casts a Mana Crypt, and Brandon draws. She casts a Wheel of Fortune, and Brandon draws from Rhystic. With no interaction left, Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7. She casts Talisman of Creativity, and Brandon draws a card. She casts the One Ring. Brandon draws from Rhystic, and the One Ring resolves. It enters, and Alana gains protection from everything. Alana ships the turn to Chris. Chris draws and casts Pyretic Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and both players draw. Chris adds 3 red, then casts Overmaster. Rhystic triggers, and both players draw again. Chris draws from Overmaster, then plays a Sekinsan, Crucible of Defiance for turn. He casts a Soul Ring, and both players draw a card. He casts Rending Volley, targeting Drannith, and both players draw. Drannith dies, and Chris casts Bergi, God of Storytelling. Rhystic's trigger, and both players draw a card. Chris passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Rhystic Study triggers, and both players draw a card. He casts Copy Artifact, and both draw again. It enters as a copy of the One Ring, and Mike gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He casts a Spellskite, and both draw from Rhystic. Mike ships the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon loses a life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts Silence. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. In response, Alana casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card targeting Silence. In response, Brandon casts Spell Pierce, targeting Force. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws a card. Spell Pierce counters Force, and with Silence still in the stack, Alana casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Silence. In response, Brandon casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Fierce. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. In response, Mike pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Silence. Rhystic triggers, and both players draw again. Silence is countered, and Brandon casts Kraum Mox. Alana draws from Rhystic, and then Brandon imprints a Windfall. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast a Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills 27 cards. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, and Alana draws a card. He cracks LED, discards his hand, adding 3 white. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Underworld Breach in his graveyard. Rhystic triggers, and Alana draws. In response, Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Seaborn Muse onto the battlefield. With Savine still in the stack, Mike casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Savine's Reclamation. Both Rhystic's trigger, and both players draw. With no answers, Mindbreak Trap exiles Savine's Reclamation. With nothing to do, Brandon passes to Mike. At the end of Brandon's turn, Alana exiles Simian Spirit Guide from her hand, adding a red. She casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Kinnan. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws a card. Kinnan is destroyed and the turn moves to Alana. Mike untaps with Alana through Seedborn. During her upkeep, the One Ring and Mana Crypt trigger. In response, Mike activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts March of Swirling Mist targeting Rograk. Both Rhystic's trigger, Mike pays for Alana's, and then Brandon draws. Rograk phases out, and Alana loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, then loses a life to the One Ring. She draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. She casts Gamble. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws. Then Alana fetches up a card into her hand and then randomly discards a Scalding Tarn. She plays a Mana Confluence for turn. She taps it to help cast Tidal Barracuda. In response, Mike casts Mana Drain. Both Rhystic's trigger and both players draw a card. In response, Alana casts Pyroblast, targeting Mana Drain. Rhystic triggers and Brandon draws again. Pyroblast counters Mana Drain, and then Tidal Barracuda resolves. Next, she casts a Mana Vault. She casts a Grim Monolith. She casts a Spring Leaf Jump. She taps her Talisman to cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. She taps her other Talisman to cast Praetor's Grasp, targeting Mike. Which she isn't supposed to do because Mike has protection from everything from the One Ring. The table missed it, but magic is hard. Anyway, Alana fetches up a card from Mike's library into exile, face down. She casts the card, which is a Mana Crypt. She casts Vampiric Tutor. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. She casts Jeska's Will. She exiles LED and 2 lands off of the top of her library. She casts Underworld Breach. She casts LED from exile. She cracks it, discards her hand, and adds 3 red. She escapes Gamble, fetching up a Brain Freeze into her graveyard since she has no cards in hand. She escapes LED, cracks it for 3 blue, then escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting herself. She does this over and over, milling her library. She escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alana wins the game. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Birgi, God of Storytelling. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora and passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He ends his turn. Chris draws and plays a Shattered Skull to hammer pass and to play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He casts a Mox Opal and Zach draws again. He casts his commander, Jeska, Thrice Reborn, and Zach draws. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Ryan's Birgi. The table prepares for war, and Chris gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Birgi. Zach takes 9 damage due to Jeska, and Ryan ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, plays a Mana Confluence, and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to cast a Worldly Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the spell. Zach discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to cast Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws a card. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws for turn and casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Peter casts a Lotus Petal, and Zach draws again. He cracks Petal to cast Rhystic Study, and Zach draws from Remora. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering the spell. Unfortunately blown out, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Chris loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Emergence Zone. He casts Jeska's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Zach. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Then Chris adds 10 red and exiles Pyroblast, Mountain, and an Ancient Tomb. He casts Pyroblast, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers, and Chris pays. Remora is destroyed, and Chris follows up with a Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. He casts Relic of Legends. He casts his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Birgi. Chris ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Brass Squire. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Birgi. Zach takes 9 through Jeska, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up an Underworld Breach onto the top of his library. Zach draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Vampiric Tutor. He casts an Underworld Breach. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap. The table goes wild as Underworld Breach is exiled. Next, Zach taps his Mana Confluence to cast Wishclaw Talisman and then ships the turn to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast Drannith Magistrate. Peter passes to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Mountain. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Dargo. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Dargo. Unfortunately, Zach cannot block, takes 21 commander damage, and Zach loses the game. Chris gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He holds open blockers and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a City of Traders. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Dargo. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Dargo. Ryan blocks with Birgi and takes 12 through Jeska. Chris passes to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jessica with Brass Squire. Jessica dies and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Peter taps Mana Confluence to cast Tainted Pact. He exiles from the top of his library until he exiles an Underworld Breach, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps Mana Confluence to cast an Underworld Breach. He escapes Lotus Petal from his graveyard. He cracks it to help cast a Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills 9 cards. He escapes Lotus Petal and cracks it for a blue. He escapes Lotus Petal again and cracks it for another blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 18. He escapes and cracks Lotus Petal 4 more times, adding 4 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and Peter wins the game. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Peter draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Rhystic Study. In response, Nick casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Rhystic. Peter passes. Ashani draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Traders. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rhystic Study. Peter groans, Study resolves, and Zach ships the turn to Nick. At the end of Zach's turn, Nick cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Nick draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Imperial Seal. Rhystic triggers, and Nick taps the City of Brass to pay for it. Then Nick fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Nick ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and then taps his City of Brass to help cast out Mystic Remora, paying the Rhystic tax. Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Gamble. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Peter and Zach draw. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mana Confluence. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps it to help cast a Rhystic Study of his own. Peter and Zach draw, then Rhystic resolves. All through, Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. Drannith resolves and Zach ships the turn. Nick draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Remora and 2 Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 players draw. The table straps in, and Nick passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also taps his City of Brass to pay for his Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch. 3 Rhystic's trigger, Peter pays 2, and then Nick draws. With nothing else, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, plays a Mountain, and passes the turn. Zach draws and plays the City of Brass. Zach ends his turn. Nick draws and passes. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep its Remora. He draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Dothi Voidwalker. 3 Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 players draw. Peter ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Nizik's Signet. He pays for both Rhystics, and Peter draws through Remora. Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver, and both players draw from Rhystic. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Drannith Magistrate. Peter takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Zach gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Counterbalance. Mystic and 2 Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 players draw. In response, Peter casts Swansong, and all 3 opponents draw again. Counterbalance is countered and exiled with a Void counter, and Nick creates a 2/2 bird. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Talisman of Dominance, and all 3 opponents draw through Rhystic and Mystic. Finished up, Nick passes. During his upkeep, Peter lets his Remora die. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Grand Abolishers. All Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 opponents draw. In response, Ashani casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Zach's Rhystic. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Nick and Zach draw, then Zach's Rhystic is bounced. Then Abolisher resolves. Next, Peter casts Underworld Breach. He attempts to escape Mystic Remora, but Zach reminds him of the Drannith Magistrate on the battlefield. Peter sinks his head as he realizes what he just did. With nothing else to do, Peter passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an island. He casts Gilded Drake. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws. In response, Nick cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers, and Ashani draws. In response, Ashani casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Gilded Drake. Rhystic's trigger, and Nick and Ashani draw. Force counters Drake, then Muddle counters Drown. Next, Ashani casts Dockside Extortionist and Nick draws from Rhystic. Dockside enters and Ashani creates 4 treasures. He casts Fabricate, Rhystic triggers and Nick draws again. Then Ashani fetches up an Imposter Mech into his hand. He casts Imposter Mech and Nick draws from Rhystic. Imposter Mech enters as a copy of Drenith Magistrate. He casts a Mox Amber and Nick draws. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystical Tutor. Both Rhystic's trigger and Ashani and Nick draw. Then Zach fetches up a Culling the Weak onto the top of his library. Ashani discards the hand size and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Tymna as an additional cost. Both Rhystic's trigger and Ashani and Nick draw. In response, Peter pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Rhystic's trigger and both draw again. In response, Zach casts Swan Song, targeting Misstep. Rhystic's trigger and both draw again. Swan Song counters Misstep. Peter creates a 2/2 bird, then Culling the Weak resolves, and Zach adds 4 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic's trigger and both players draw. In response, Nick casts Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Ashani and Nick draw from Rhystic, and in response, Peter casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers and both draw. Ad Naus is countered, and Force counters Pact. Next, Zach taps the City of Brez to help cast Rhystic Study. Nick and Ashani draw through Rhystic, Zach's Rhystic resolves, and Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Nick casts Limdul's Vault. Both Rhystic's trigger and Zach and Ashani draw. He looks at the top 5, doesn't like what he sees, pays a life, and continues the process. He does this 2 more times, paying 2 more life, then shuffling and rearranging the top 5. He draws and plays a snow-covered island. He taps his City of Brass to help cast a Phantasmal Image. Rhystic trigger and Zach and Ashani draw. In response, Ashani taps his City of Brass to help cast Stern Scolding. In response, Nick taps his Talisman to cast Spell Pierce, targeting Stern Scolding. Rhystic's trigger and both draw again. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting all spells on the stack. Rhystic's trigger and both players draw. All are exiled, then Nick follows up by casting Kraum Mox. Rhystic trigger and both players draw. Kraum Mox enters and Nick imprints Stern Scolding. He casts Mox Opal and both draw again. He taps his Ancient Doom to cast an Arcane Signet and both players draw from Rhystic. With nothing else, Nick passes, discarding the hand size into the Void Zone. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers and all 3 players draw. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 treasures. He taps the City of Brass to cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Ashani's Drenith. Rhystic triggers and all players draw again. Imposter Mech bounces, and then Peter casts Mayhem Devil. Each player draws through Rhystic, and Mayhem Devil resolves. Peter cracks 3 treasures, floating mana. Mayhem Devil triggers 3 times, killing Zach's Drenith. He casts his commander, Kenrith the Return King. He sacrifices Dothy Voidwalker, casting Zach's Culling the Weak from exile, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He activates Kenrith's last ability, Reanimating Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 more treasures. He cracks 2 treasures, adding 2 green. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Zach for 2. He activates Kenrith's second ability, targeting Phantasmal Dockside. It triggers and Peter sacrifices it. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals 1 to Ashani. Peter presents a loop of Reanimated Image, creating treasures through Dockside, then sacrificing it through Kenrith's ability. Each time he cracks a treasure or sacrifices Image, he pings opponents through Mayhem Devil. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. But Mike has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Yavimaya Coast. Brandon draws for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast a Mana Vault. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Bloom Tender. He ships the turn. Cruz draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He ends the turn. Zach draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Crombat and attacks Cruz with Kraum. Cruz takes it, and Brandon gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Springleaf Drum. Kraum triggers and Brandon draws. He casts an Arcane Signet. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Mana Crypt. He casts a Time Twister. Kraum triggers and Brandon draws. In response, Brandon casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Time Twister. Force counters and exiles Twister, and Cruz passes. Zach draws and plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts Wild Growth, enchanting his forest. He casts his commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. He ships the turn to Brandon. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage to his Mana Vault. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kraum. Mike takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Brandon ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Treasure Vault. He casts Wandering Archaic. He passes to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Felwar Stone. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Kraum triggers and Brandon draws. He ships the turn. Zach draws and casts a Relic Golem. Selvala triggers and Zach draws. He taps Selvala for 6 green. He casts Survival of the Fittest and Brandon draws through Kraum. In response, Brandon casts Pact of Negation, targeting Survival. Wandering Archaic triggers and Mike copies Pact, targeting Survival. Mike's Pact resolves, countering Survival, then the original Pact fizzles. Zach casts a Boreal Druid. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Finehorn Elves to untap Selvala. He recasts Finehorn Elves. He plays a Snow-Covered Forest and gives the turn to Brandon. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage through his Mana Ball. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He attacks Cruz with Kraum. Cruz takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts an Arcane Signet. Brandon passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike sacrifices his Treasure Vault, creating 2 treasures. During his upkeep, Mike pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 cards and puts a Nezahal, Primal Tide, onto the battlefield. Selvala triggers and Mike draws. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, plays a City of Brass, and gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Brandon casts Enlightened Tutor, Nezahal and Archaic trigger, and then Brandon taps Mana Confluence to pay for Archaic, and then Mike draws. He fetches up an Underworld Breach onto the top of his library. Still in Zach's end step, Zach activates Relic Golem, milling Brandon for 2. The table goes wild as Brandon takes his turn. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage through his Mana Ball. He plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kraum. Mike takes it, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts Rite of Flame. Nezahal and Archaic trigger, Mike draws and then copies Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. Then Brandon adds 2 red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Cruz activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Flusterstorm into his hand. Still in response, Mike casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. In response, Brandon hard casts Mindbreak Trap, targeting Force of Will. This is when Brandon remembers the Wandering Archaic on the battlefield. Archaic and Nezahal trigger, Mike draws, and then Mike copies Mindbreak Trap, targeting Mindbreak Trap and Dockside. Trap resolves, exiling both spells. Brandon ends his turn. Mike draws and casts a Void Winnower. Selvala triggers and Mike draws a card. He casts a Mana Crypt and Brandon draws through Kraum. He plays a Seagate Reborn into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts Seedborn Muse. He attacks Cruz with Nezahal and Wandering Archaic. Cruz takes it and Mike passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Cruz taps his City of Brass to help cast a Mystical Tutor. Nezahal and Archaic trigger, Mike copies Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Cyclonic Rift onto the top of his library. He then draws through Nezahal. Then Cruz fetches up a Windfall onto the top of his library. Mike untaps his permanents with Cruz through Seedborn Muse. During Cruz's upkeep, Mike casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Cruz floats a black and 2 colorless. Zach activates Selvala, floating 6 green. Still in response, Zach activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Finehorn Elves to untap Selvala. He then taps Selvala for another 6 green. Cyclonic Rift resolves, bouncing all non-land permanents. Cruz draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach casts Nature's Claim, targeting Mike's Mana Crypt. Mike draws through Nezahal and then chooses not to copy it. Nature's Claim resolves, Mana Crypt is destroyed, and Mike gains 4 life. Still in the end step, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5 cards of his library, failing to find. The turn moves to Zach. Mike untaps his permanents with Zach through Seedborn. Zach draws and casts a Wild Growth, enchanting his Snow-Covered Forest. Nezahal triggers and Mike draws. He recasts Boreal Druid. He recasts Finehorn Elves. He recasts Wirewood Symbiote. Zach ends his turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Mike activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Tidespout Tyrant onto the battlefield. Mike untaps his permanents with Brandon through Seedborn Muse. During Brandon's upkeep, Mike activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5, putting Hullbreaker Horror onto the battlefield. Brandon draws and then casts Toxic Deluge, paying 9 life. Nezahal triggers and Mike draws. In response to Deluge, Mike casts Unsubstantiate, targeting Wirewood Symbiote, triggering Tidespout Tyrant and Hullbreaker Horror. He bounces Cruz's Underground Sea and then Toxic Deluge. Brandon taps Forbidden Orchard to help cast Mana Vault, giving Cruz the Spirit. He taps his Mana Confluence to help recast Toxic Deluge, paying 9 life again. Nezahal triggers and Mike draws a card. In response, he discards 3 cards into exile through Nezahal. Toxic Deluge resolves, killing all creatures. Brandon ships the turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Nezahal returns to the battlefield. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb to recast Kinnan. He casts Rhystic Study. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Nezahal. Brandon takes it, and Mike gives the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and replays his Underground Sea. He casts a Mana Crypt. Rhystic and Nezahal trigger, and Mike draws 2. He casts a Felwar Stone, and Mike draws 2 again. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Windfall, triggering Nezahal and Rhystic Study. Mike draws from Nezahal and then declines to draw through Rhystic. Windfall resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. He casts a Mox Diamond, and Mike draws 2 through Nezahal and Study. Diamond resolves, and Cruz discards a Scalding Tarn. He casts a Mystic Remora, and Mike draws 2 again. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a snow-covered forest. He recasts Selvala and Mike draws through Ristic. He passes the turn. During his draw step, Brandon takes the damage through his Mana Vault. He draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. Cruz draws through Mystic Remora, and Mike draws 2 through Nezahal and Study. He plays an Exotic Orchard. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help recast Tymna, letting Mike draw. He taps his Mana Confluence, going to 1 life to help cast Thassa's Oracle. He pays 1 for Ristic. Thassa's Oracle resolves, and Brandon looks at the top 2 cards of his library. He puts one on top and the other on bottom. He ships the turn to Mike. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike channels Colossal Sky Turtle, returning Force of Will to his hand. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Soul Ring, letting Cruz draw. He casts Basalt Monolith, and Cruz draws again. He taps the Monolith for 4 colorless through Kinnan, and then untaps it for 3. He repeats this process for infinite colorless mana. He casts a Mirage Mirror, paying for Remora. He presents a loop of holding priority, activating Mirage Mirror, targeting his Command Tower and Basalt Monolith, and then is able to tap it for any color, and then untapping it, generating infinite mana of all colors. He activates Kinnan, putting all non-humans from his library onto the battlefield, including a Thrasios Triton hero. He activates Thrasios, putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped and the remaining cards into his hand. He casts a Finale of Devastation where X equals 420,069, giving all of his creatures haste. He moves to combat, attacks for lethal, and Mike wins the game. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Boseiju who endures. He casts a Wild Growth. He passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Mana Confluence. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Mox Amber. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Mystic Remora. In response, Cruz pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Mystic Remora. Mike ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Watery Grave. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Elf as it enters. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Manglehorn. Manglehorn resolves and destroys Cruz's Soul Ring. He ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He pays 2 life to cast Taxian Probe. He looks at Mike's hand and draws a card. He casts a Grim Monolith. Unfortunately, he forgot about Manglehorn, so Grim Monolith enters tapped. A very sad Brandon ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Command Tower. He does nothing else and passes. During his upkeep, Cruz loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Tymna. Brandon takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Cruz pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He ships the turn. Zach draws and casts his commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. He ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. Brandon passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike flashes in a Hullbreaker Horror. The table gets a massive sense of horror as Brandon passes the turn. Mike draws and casts Phantasmal Image. Hullbreaker Horror triggers and Mike bounces Selvala. Phantasmal Image resolves, entering as a copy of Kraum. He moves to combat and attacks Cruz with Kraum. In response, Cruz casts Swift Reconfiguration targeting Mike's Kraum. Kraum triggers and sacrifices itself through Phantasmal Image. In his second main phase, he channels Colossal Sky Turtle, return Mystic Remora from his graveyard to his hand. He casts the Remora, Hullbreaker Horror, and Kraum trigger. Brandon draws a card and Mike bounces Kraum. In a repeat of turn 1, Brandon pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the Remora. Mike goes to scream into a pillow and ships the turn to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Tymna. Brandon takes it, and in his second main phase, Cruz pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts a Mystic Remora of his own. He passes to Zach. Zach draws and recasts Selvala. He casts Finehorn Elves. He attacks Brandon with Manglehorn. He gives the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Toxic Deluge, paying 8 life. Mystic Remora triggers and Cruz draws. In response, Cruz activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing an Ancient Tomb onto the battlefield tapped. With no other answers, Deluge resolves, wiping the board. Next, Brandon casts Time Twister and Cruz draws through Remora. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7. He casts a Mox Diamond and Cruz draws again. Diamond resolves and Brandon discards a Polluted Delta. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. For the 3rd time, he casts Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Cruz draws. Finally, with no answers, Mike's Remora resolves. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Cruz wins his Mana Crypt roll and then pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He recasts Thrasios. He passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting both Mystic Remoras. Both Remoras trigger, and Mike and Cruz draw. In response, Cruz casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Force of Vigor. Mike's Remora triggers and he draws. Fierce counters Force, and Cruz passes, discarding to hand size. Zach draws and plays a snow-covered forest. He recasts Selvala. He casts a Mana Crypt, letting Louise and Mike draw through Remora. He gives the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Gamble, letting Cruz and Mike draw. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Brain Freeze. He casts Ad Nauseam, and Cruz and Mike draw. In response, Cruz taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Intuition, targeting Mike. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Intuition resolves and Cruz reveals a Savine's Reclamation, Grand Abolisher, and a Force of Negation. Mike gives him Force of Negation. Still in response to Ad Nauseam, Cruz casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Ad Naus. Force resolves, countering and exiling Ad Nauseam. Brandon passes the turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Mike casts Worldly Tutor. Remora triggers and Cruz draws. Mike fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. During his upkeep, Mike lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Bark Channel Pathway. He recasts Kennen. He casts Seedborn Muse. Mike ships the turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Cruz casts Snapback, exiling a blue card, bouncing Seedborn Muse. Mike discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. In response to his Mystic Remora, he casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Silence onto the top of his library, and then lets his Remora die. Still in Cruz's upkeep, Zach casts Beast Within, targeting Cruz's Ancient Tomb. Ancient Tomb is destroyed, and Cruz creates a 3/3 Beast. He draws and casts Silence. In response, Brandon flashes in a Dress Down. Dress Down enters, and Brandon draws. Then Silence resolves, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Cruz casts Culling Ritual. It resolves, destroying all non-land permanents with mana value 2 or less, and Cruz adds 8 black and 6 green. He casts a Praetor's Grasp. He searches Brandon's library for a card into exile face down. He casts a Demonic Tutor through Praetor's Grasp, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Peer into the Abyss. He draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Soul Ring. He holds priority and then pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Soul Ring. Still holding priority, he casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Mental Misstep. Misstep is countered and Cruz creates 2 treasures. Soul Ring resolves and Cruz casts Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters and in response, he casts Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Louise wins the game. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Amber. He ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts a Kraum Mox, imprinting Chain of Vapor. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kraum. Mike takes the damage, and Brandon passes the turn. Cruz draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Spired Garden. He casts Carpet of Flowers, and Cruz draws through Sentinel. With nothing else, Cal ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Botanical Sanctum. He casts his commander, Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. He passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Kraum. Cal takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. All through, he ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Taiga. He casts an Arbor Elf and passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 1 red through his Carpet of Flowers. He plays a Taiga for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Cal creates 3 treasures. He casts his commander, Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. Brandon draws through Kraum, and then Cruz draws through Sentinel. Minsc and Boo enter, and Cal creates a Boo token. He activates Minsc and Boo's first ability, putting 3+1/+1 counters onto Boo. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Boo. Brandon takes it, and then Cal gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, and Mike creates 3 treasures. He casts Basalt Monolith. Brandon draws through Kraum, and then Cruz draws through Sentinel. In response, Brandon casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Basalt Monolith. Sentinel triggers, and Cruz draws. Force resolves, saving the table, countering and exiling Basalt Monolith. Finished up, Mike passes the turn. Brandon draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cruz with Tymna and Minsc and Boo with Kraum. Minsc and Boo dies, and Cruz takes the damage. In his second main phase, Brandon pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays an Arid Mesa for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Demonic Tutor, and Cruz draws through Sentinel. Demonic Tutor resolves, and Brandon fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He escapes Demonic Tutor from his graveyard. In response, Cruz casts Silence. It resolves, and another win attempt is thwarted. Demonic Tutor resolves, and Brandon fetches up a card into his hand. He moves to his end step, Underworld Breach is sacrificed, and Brandon ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cruz casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Pyre of Heroes onto the top of his library. He draws and casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing Taiga as an additional cost. Kraum triggers, and Brandon draws. Cruz fetches up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. He casts Pyre of Heroes. He plays a command tower for turn. Cruz activates Pyre of Heroes, sacrificing Esper Sentinel and fetching up a Durannith Magistrate onto the battlefield. All through, he ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Forest. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Boo. Mike takes it, and Cal passes the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a turn Timber, Serpentine Wood into play untapped, paying 3 life. He cracks his knuckles and casts Nezahal, the Primal Tide. Mike gives the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Underground Sea. He moves to combat and attacks Cruz with Kraum and Cal with Tymna. They declare no blocks and both take the damage. In his second main phase, Brandon pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts Mystic Remora and Mike draws through Nezahal. Remora resolves and Brandon ends the turn. Cruz draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human as it enters. He casts his commander, Will the Wise. It enters and Cal, Mike, and Brandon each investigate, and then Cruz creates 4 clues of his own. He activates Pyre of Heroes, sacrificing Will the Wise. Will triggers and Cal, Mike, and Brandon each lose a life, and Cruz creates a clue. Pyre's ability resolves and Cruz fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos onto the battlefield. Ranger Captain enters and Cruz fetches up a Viscera Seer into his hand. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow and Brandon draws through Kraum. He suspends Greater Gargadon with 10 time counters. Cruz passes the turn. At the end of Cruz's turn, Cal sacrifices the clue and draws a card. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cruz with Boo. Cruz takes it, and with nothing else, Cal ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and casts out Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Brandon draws. Mike activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Nyx Bloom Ancient onto the battlefield. He activates Kinnan again, looks at the top 5, and puts a Phyrexian Metamorph onto the battlefield as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and in response, Brandon sacrifices 2 clues and draws 2 cards. Cruz also responds by sacrificing 5 clues to Greater Gargadon, removing 5 time counters. Then Mike creates 4 treasures through Dockside. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, but fails to find. He activates Kinnan again, looking at the top 5, and again fails to find. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts a Galecaster Colossus onto the battlefield. Mike sacrifices the clue and draws a card. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Nezahal and Kinnan. Brandon declares no blocks and takes the damage. Mike passes the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Mike draws through Nezahal, and then Brandon draws through Remora. In response, Cal casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Nyx Bloom Ancient and Mystic Remora. Brandon responds by casting Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Force of Vigor. Mike draws through Nezahal, then Swat changes the targets of Vigor to Nyx Bloom Ancient and Pyre of Heroes. Then Force of Vigor resolves, destroying both. Then Wheel resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Next, Brandon casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Brandon creates 4 treasures. He casts Imperial Seal, and Mike draws through Nezahal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Kraum and Cal with Tymna. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Brandon pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts Gamble, and Mike draws through Nezahal. Gamble resolves, and he fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Esper Sentinel. Brandon casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, Brandon holds priority and casts Demonic Consultation. Nezahal triggers, and Mike draws. Consultation resolves, and Brandon calls his shot, naming "You Are Already Dead," and exiles his library. In response to the Oracle trigger, Cal casts Unleash Fury targeting Boo, and Mike draws through Nezahal. Cal casts Invigorate for its alternate cost targeting Boo, and Brandon gains 3 life. Nezahal triggers, and Mike draws. Kraum triggers, and, unable to draw a card with an empty library, Brandon dies. Little did he know that he was the one that was already dead. The turn ships to Cruz. During his upkeep, Cruz removes a time counter from Greater Gargadon. He draws and exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Avacyn's Pilgrim. He taps his Gaia's Cradle, then activates Ranger Captain of Eos, sacrificing it. Ranger's ability resolves, and the table holds their breath. Cruz casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Cruz creates 4 treasures. He casts his commander, Max the Daredevil. He pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. He taps Elves of Deep Shadow to help activate Birthing Pod, paying 2 more life and sacrificing Max. He fetches up an Academy Rector onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Academy Rector through Gargadon, removing a time counter from Gargadon. Rector triggers, Cruz exiles it, fetching up a Pattern of Rebirth onto the battlefield, attaching it to Elves of Deep Shadow. He sacrifices Elves of Deep Shadow through Gargadon and removes another time counter. Pattern of Rebirth triggers, and he fetches up a Protean Hulk onto the battlefield. He sacrifices Protean Hulk through Gargadon and removes another time counter. Protean Hulk triggers, and Cruz fetches up a Grand Abolisher, Activated Sleeper, and Carrion Feeder onto the battlefield. Activated Sleeper enters as a copy of Protean Hulk. He then activates Carrion Feeder, sacrificing Protean Hulk. Hulk triggers again, and he fetches up Emil the Blessed and Bloom Tender onto the battlefield. He presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Dockside, and creating infinite treasures. He casts Will the Wise. He presents a loop of activating Emil, flickering Will to create infinite clues. He sacrifices the clues until he draws Blind Obedience. He casts Blind Obedience. He presents a loop of sacrificing Will the Wise to Carrion Feeder, recasting it with his infinite mana, and extorting through Blind Obedience to kill the table, and Cruz wins the game. Drake draws and plays a City of Traders. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Bergi, God of Storytelling. He ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He casts his commander, Rograk, Son of Roga. He passes. Cruz draws and plays a Savannah. With no other actions, he ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Mana Crypt. He pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Ashani. He looks at Ashani's hand and draws a card. He casts a Rhystic Study. In response, Ashani casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Bergi. Bergi is exiled and Rhystic Study resolves. Brandon gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and floats mana through his City of Traders. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. City of Traders triggers and sacrifices itself. He casts Grim Monolith. Rhystic Study triggers and Brandon draws. He casts Wheel of Misfortune and Brandon draws again. Wheel resolves, Drake and Cruz secretly choose 3, Ashani chooses 0, and Brandon chooses 5. Drake, Cruz, and Brandon discard their hands and draw 7, and Brandon takes 5 damage. With no other actions, Drake passes the turn. Ashani draws and moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Ragavan. Brandon takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ashani creates a treasure, and Brandon exiles a Witchclaw Talisman. In his second main phase, he plays a City of Traders. He casts Pyroblast, targeting Rhystic Study. Brandon draws through Study, and in response, he pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Pyroblast. Ashani casts a Rhystic Study of his own, and Brandon draws again. Study resolves, and Ashani ends his turn. Cruz draws and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts a Soul Ring, and Brandon and Ashani draw through Rhystic. He plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Will the Wise. Ashani and Brandon draw through Rhystic, then Will enters. Brandon loses a life, Drake and Ashani investigate, and Cruz investigates 3 times. He cracks a clue and draws a card. All through, he ships the turn. During his upkeep, Brandon loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Mana Vault, paying for Rhystic. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with Kraum. Ashani takes the hit and Brandon passes, discarding to hand size. Drake draws and plays a Barbarian Ring. He taps it to help cast Ruby Medallion, and Ashani and Brandon draw through Rhystic. Drake gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Ragavan. Brandon takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ashani creates a treasure, and Brandon exiles a Dress Down. In his second main phase, Ashani adds 2 colorless through City of Traders. He plays an Underground Sea. City of Traders triggers and sacrifices itself. He casts Demonic Tutor, and Brandon draws. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Dockside Extortionist, and Brandon draws again. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 9 treasures. He casts Snap, targeting Dockside, and Brandon draws. Dockside bounces, and Ashani untaps 2 lands. He recasts Dockside, and Brandon draws again. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 9 more treasures. He casts Bolus's Citadel, paying the Rhystic tax. He pays a life to cast Springleaf Drum off of the top of his library through Bolus's Citadel. Rhystic triggers, and Brandon draws. He pays a life and casts Soul Ring through Citadel, and Brandon draws again. He casts Paradise Mantle through Citadel, and Brandon draws. He cracks a clue and draws a card. He casts Tainted Pact, paying for Rhystic. He exiles until he puts Bergi, God of Storytelling, into his hand. He casts Harnfell, Horn of Bounty, and Brandon draws. He activates Harnfell, discarding a card and exiling Arid Mesa and Transmute Artifact. He pays 3 life to cast Simian Spirit Guide through Citadel, and Brandon draws through Rhystic. He activates Harnfell, discarding a card and exiling Mana Confluence and Flooded Strand. He pays 3 life to cast Praetor's Grasp through Citadel, targeting Brandon. Rhystic triggers, and Brandon draws. Ashani then fetches up a card into exile face down. He casts Enlightened Tutor through Praetor's Grasp, and Brandon draws. He fetches up a Necropotence onto the top of his library. He pays 3 life to cast Necropotence through Citadel, and Brandon draws. He activates Necropotence 3 times, paying 3 life and exiling 3 cards. He pays 3 life to cast Windfall through Bolus's Citadel. Rhystic triggers, and in response, Ashani activates Necro 3 times, paying 3 life and exiling 3 cards. Rhystic triggers resolves, and Brandon draws. Then Windfall resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 22 cards. He casts a Mox Amber, and Brandon draws. He casts a Lotus Petal, and Brandon draws again. He casts a Mana Vault, and Brandon draws. He casts a Defense Grid, and Brandon draws through Rhystic. In response, Brandon casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Defense Grid, and Ashani draws through Rhystic. In response, Ashani casts a Force of Will for its alternate cost, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Brandon draws, and in response, he casts a Force of Will of his own for its alternate cost, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Ashani's Force of Will. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. Then Force counters Force. In response to Fierce Guardianship, Ashani activates Harnfell, discarding a card and exiling Steam Vents and Toxic Deluge. He casts a Dispel, targeting Fierce Guardianship, and Brandon draws through Rhystic. With no other answers, Dispel counters Fierce, and Defense Grid finally resolves. He equips Paradise Mantle to Rograk. He casts a Mox Opal, and Brandon draws a card. He casts Dramatic Versal, and Brandon draws again. Then Ashani then taps his non-land permanents. He casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his own Dockside, and Brandon draws a card. Dockside bounces, and he doesn't continue the chain. He recasts Dockside, and Brandon draws a card. Dockside resolves, and Ashani creates 9 treasures. He casts Imperial Seal, and Brandon draws through Rhystic. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He pays 2 life to cast Thassa's Oracle through Citadel. Rhystic triggers, and Brandon draws. Oracle resolves, and in response, Ashani casts Demonic Consultation. Brandon draws, Consult resolves, and Ashani names You Are Already Dead, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Ashani wins the game. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Tundra. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Morphic Pool. He casts Drannith Magistrate. The table groans, and Zach passes the turn. Sinusky draws for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Lotus Petal. Well situated, Sinusky ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Lotus Petal. Remora triggers and Sinusky draws. Zane ships the turn. Memo draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora of his own. Remora triggers and Sinusky draws. Memo casts Rograk, Son of Roga. Sinusky and Zane stare at their own Rograks locked out by Drannith Magistrate and shake their heads at the irony. All through, Memo sends the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts a Chrome Mox. Both Remora's trigger and Memo and Sinusky draw. It resolves and Zach imprints Pact of Negation. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Drannith Magistrate. Zane takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Finished up, Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sinusky pays for his Mystic Remora. Also in his upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. Zane draws and plays an Underground Sea. With no further actions, he ends his turn. During his upkeep, Memo pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Sinusky draws. Memo casts Talisman of Progress. Remora triggers and Sinusky draws again. All finished, Memo passes the turn. Zach draws and heads straight to combat. He attacks Sinusky with Tymna and Zane with Drannith. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He plays a Wooded Foothills as his land for turn. He casts Counterbalance. Both Remora's trigger and Memo and Sinusky draw. Then Counterbalance resolves. Finished up, Zach passes to Sinusky. During his upkeep, Sinusky pays for his Remora. Also in his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Talisman of Dominance. Remora and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals a Flooded Strand off of the top of his library through Counterbalance, and then Memo draws a card through Remora. Then Talisman resolves. All through, Sinusky ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Volcanic Island. With no further actions, once again, he passes to Memo. During Memo's upkeep, his Remora triggers. In response, he casts Worldly Tutor, Counterbalance, and Remora trigger. Sinusky draws, then Zach declines to reveal through Counterbalance. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Memo fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. He then pays for his Remora. He draws for turn and then plays a Plateau. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Counterbalance triggers, and in response, Zach sacrifices his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He reveals a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer through Counterbalance, then Dockside resolves. It enters, and Memo creates 8 treasures. Memo ends his turn. Zach draws for turn and then dashes in Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Tymna and Sinusky with Ragavan. Both declare no blocks, Ragavan triggers, Zach creates a treasure, and Sinusky exiles Rhystic Study off of the top of his library. In his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He plays a City of Traders as his land for turn. He casts Sinusky's Rhystic Study from exile. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sinusky draw. In response, Sinusky casts Swansong, targeting Rhystic Study. Remora and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals a Dark Ritual off of the top of his library, countering Swansong. Then Memo draws through Remora. With Rhystic still in the stack, Memo flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. It resolves, and with Rhystic still in the stack, Zane hard casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Rhystic. Both Remoras and Counterbalance trigger, and in response, Zach casts a Swansong of his own, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sinusky draw. In response, Memo casts Eladamri's Call. Remora triggers, and Sinusky draws. Eladamri's Call resolves, and Memo fetches up a Grim Hireling into his hand. Then Swansong counters Fierce Guardianship, and Zane creates a 2/2 bird. Then the Remora triggers resolve, and Memo and Sinusky draw. Finally, Rhystic Study resolves. Zach moves to his end step, and Ragavan returns to Zach's hand. The turn moves to Sinusky. During his upkeep, Sanuski pays for his Remora. He also loses his Mana Crypt Flip, taking 3 damage. He draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Talisman of Indulgence. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic all trigger. Zach draws through Rhystic, then reveals an Underworld Breach off the top of his library through Counterbalance, countering Talisman. Then Memo draws through Remora. Next, Sanuski casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger, Zach draws through Rhystic, then reveals Rhystic Study off at the top of his library. Then Ragavan resolves. Sanuski casts Mox Amber. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic all trigger again. Zach draws through Rhystic, then reveals a Talisman of Creativity through Counterbalance, then Memo draws through Remora, then the Mox Amber resolves. Sanuski passes, discarding to hand size. Zane draws and casts Time Twister. Remora, Rhystic, Counterbalance, and Remora all trigger. Sanuski draws through Remora, Zach draws through Rhystic, then chooses not to reveal through Counterbalance, and then Memo draws through Remora. With Time Twister still in the stack, Memo casts Veil of Summer. Rhystic, Counterbalance, and Remora trigger, Sanuski draws through Remora, Zach reveals Mox Opal through Counterbalance, and then draws through Rhystic. In response to Time Twister, Sanuski casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Veil of Summer. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic trigger, Zach draws, doesn't reveal through Counterbalance, and Memo draws through Remora. In response, Memo casts Swan Song, targeting Force of Negation. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Remora trigger. Sanuski draws, Zach draws, then reveals a Toxic Deluge through Counterbalance. In response, Sanuski casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Swan Song. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic trigger, Zach draws, chooses not to reveal through Counterbalance, and then Memo draws. Finally, with nothing else, Red Blast counters Swan Song, and Force of Negation counters and exiles Veil of Summer. With Time Twister still in the stack, Sanuski exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, floating a red. Then Time Twister resolves, everyone shuffles their hands and graveyards into their libraries, and then draws 7. Next, Zane plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He attempts to move through phases, and in response, Sanuski uses his floating red to cast Red Elemental Blast, targeting Counterbalance. Remora, Rhystic, and Counterbalance all trigger. Zach reveals a Watery Grave through Counterbalance, Zach draws through Rhystic, and then Memo draws through Remora. Then Red Elemental Blast resolves, and Counterbalance is destroyed. All through, Zane passes to Memo. During Memo's upkeep, his Remora triggers. In response, he casts Mystical Tutor. Sanuski's Remora triggers, and he draws. Tutor resolves, and Memo fetches up a Tainted Pact onto the top of his library. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand to help pay for Remora. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Ball. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zach draw. Memo casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zach draw again. Evolution resolves, and Memo fetches up a Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. Oracle triggers, and holding priority, Memo casts Tainted Pact. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zach draw. In response, Sanuski casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a Brain Freeze, targeting Tainted Pact. Rhystic or Remora trigger, and Zach and Memo draw. In response, Memo hardcasts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Force of Negation. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zach draw again. In response, Sanuski casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing Underground Sea back to his hand, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Rhystic and Remora trigger, and Zach and Memo draw. Unfortunately tapped up, Memo has no response. Daze counters Fierce Guardianship, then Force of Negation counters and exiles Tainted Pact. Then Oracle's trigger resolves, and Memo looks at the top 3 cards of his library, leaving one on top and bottoming the rest. Plans thwarted, Memo passes the turn. At the end of Memo's turn, Zach casts Brainstorm. Both Remora triggers, and Sanuski and Memo draw. Then Brainstorm resolves, and Zach draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. The turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and casts Grim Tutor. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Then Zach fetches up a card into his hand and loses 3 life. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Memo draws a card and gains a life. Zach plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. City of Traders triggers, and he sacrifices it. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Memo casts Force of Whale for its alternate cost, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Dockside. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zach draw. Then Force resolves, countering Dockside. Next, Zach casts Mystic Remora. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Then Remora resolves. He casts a Mana Ball. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw again. He casts a Lotus Petal, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Zach casts Time Twister. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. In response, Sanuski casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Time Twister. Both Remora's and Rhystic trigger, Memo draws 1, and Zach draws 2. Then Flusterstorm resolves, countering Time Twister. Zach casts a Felwar Stone. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. He casts an Esper Sentinel. With nothing else, Zach passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Sanuski's Remora and Mana Crypt trigger. He wins his Mana Crypt roll, and with a Remora trigger still in the stack, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Remora, Rhystic, Esper Sentinel, and Remora all trigger. Zach draws 3, and Memo draws 1. Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Sanuski fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then he lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Gemstone Mine. He casts Demonic Tutor. Both Rystic's and Remora trigger, Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. Then Demonic resolves and Sinutski fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Tymna Vault. Remora's and Rystic trigger, Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. Sinutski casts Defense Grid, Pain for Rystic. Both Remora's trigger and Zach and Memo draw. In response, Zach casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Defense Grid. Remora triggers and Memo draws. Force resolves, countering and exiling Defense Grid. Next, Sinutski casts Rite of Flame. Rystic and Remora's trigger, Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. Rite resolves and Sinutski adds 2 red. He casts Dark Ritual, Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. Then Ritual resolves and Sinutski adds 3 black. He casts Burgi, God of Storytelling. Zach's Rystic triggers and he draws. Then Burgi resolves. Sinutski casts Mox Opal. Burgi, Remora, Rystic, and Remora all trigger. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sinutski adds a red through Burgi. Then Opal resolves. Sinutski casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Ragavan as an additional cost. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, and then Sinutski adds a red through Burgi. Then Culling the Weak resolves and he adds 4 black. Sinutski casts Jeska's Will. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sinutski adds a red through Burgi. Then Will resolves and Sinutski exiles a Mystical Tutor, Crystal Vein, and a Mnemonic Betrayal. Sinutski follows it up by casting a Windfall. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sinutski adds a red through Burgi. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Windfall. Memo's Remora triggers, and in response, Sinutski casts Tainted Pact. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, and then Sinutski adds a red through Burgi. Then Tainted Pact resolves. He exiles until he finds a Chain of Vapor and puts it into his hand. Then the other 3 note that Sinutski exiled Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Dockside, and wonder what exactly Sinutski has in mind. With Windfall still in the stack, Sinutski casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his own Mox Opal. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sinutski adds a red through Burgi. Chain resolves, bouncing Mox Opal back to Sinutski's hand, and then he sacrifices Blood Crypt to copy the chain, targeting his own Mana Crypt. Crypt bounces, he sacrifices a Badlands to copy the chain, targeting his own Talisman of Dominance. Talisman bounces, he sacrifices Gemstone Caverns to copy the chain, targeting Zach's Drannith Magistrate. Drannith bounces, and Zach sacrifices a Tundra to copy the chain, targeting Sinutski's Burgi. Burgi bounces, and Sinutski doesn't continue the chain. Then Fierce Guardianship resolves, countering Windfall. Next, Sinutski casts Mana Crypt. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. He casts Mox Opal. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1 again. Sinutski follows it up with a Mnemonic Betrayal. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. In response, Zane casts Swan Song, targeting Betrayal. Remora, Rystic, Esper Sentinel, and Remora all trigger. In response, Sinutski pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Swan Song. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1, and in response, Memo casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Mnemonic Betrayal and Mental Misstep. Remora, Rystic, and Esper all trigger, and Zach draws 3. Mindbreak Trap resolves, exiling both spells. Then Zach's Remora, Rystic, and Esper triggers, and Memo's Remora triggers all resolve, and Zach draws 3 and Memo draws 1. Then Swan Song fizzles. Next, Sinutski casts Talisman of Dominance. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. He casts Mystical Tutor. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1 again. Then Tutor resolves and Sinutski fetches up a Demonic Consultation onto the top of his library. Archivist of Ogma triggers and Memo draws a card and gains a life. After a very long turn, Sinutski passes to Zane. Zane draws for turn and casts Tainted Pact. Remora, Rystic, Sentinel, and Remora all trigger. Zach draws 3 and Memo draws 1. Then Pact resolves and Zane exiles until he finds a Mnemonic Betrayal and puts it into his hand. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. Zach draws 2 and Memo draws 1. In response, Memo casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Betrayal. Remora, Rystic, and Sentinel all trigger, and Zach draws 3. Force resolves, countering and exiling Mnemonic Betrayal. Zane plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Mox Opal. Zach draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Opal resolves. Finished up, Zane passes to Memo. During his upkeep, Memo lets his Remora die. During his draw step, he takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He draws and casts Grand Abolisher, paying for Rystic. In response, Zach casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Grand Abolisher. In response, Memo casts Pact of Negation, paying for both Rystic and Sentinel. Remora triggers and Zach draws. In response, Zane cracks his Flooded Strand, paying a life, but actually fails to find a land. Memo's Archivist of Ogma triggers, and he gains a life and draws a card. Pact of Negation resolves, countering Force of Will. Then Grand Abolisher resolves. Memo plays an Exotic Orchard as his land for turn. He casts a Mana Crypt. Zach skips his draws as he sees the writing on the wall. Memo casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Volcanic Island. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Demonic Consultation. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He escapes Soul Partition from his graveyard, targeting Thassa's Oracle. It resolves and Oracle is exiled. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks LED and adds 3 blue. He casts Thassa's Oracle from exile. Thassa's Oracle triggers, and in response, Memo escapes Demonic Consultation, naming You Are Already Dead. Consult resolves and Memo exiles his library. Then Oracle's trigger resolves, and Memo wins the game. But Lua and Ian have pre-game actions. Lua puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Vryn Wingmare. Ian also puts the Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Windswept Heath. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Elvish Mystic. He passes the turn. Lua draws and plays an Arid Mesa. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. She casts a Drannith Magistrate. She gives the turn to Brian. Brian draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He ships the turn. Ian draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Amber. He casts Mystic Remora. He ends his turn. Cal draws, plays a Windswept Heath, and passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Brian cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Lua draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. She casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. She cracks Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. She casts Skrelv, Deflector Might. She moves to combat and attacks Brian with Drannith. Brian takes it, and Lua passes. Brian draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He gives the turn to Ian. During his upkeep, Ian pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Talisman of Curiosity. He casts Mox Opal. Ian passes. At the end of Ian's turn, Cal cracks his Windswept Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield tapped. Cal draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Vexing Shusher. He ships the turn to Lua. Lua draws and plays a Shattered Skull, the Hammer Pass, into play untapped, paying 3 life. She casts her commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. In response, Brian casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card targeting Winota. Mystic Remora triggers and Ian draws. Force of Will resolves, countering Winota. Lua moves to combat and attacks Brian with Spirit of the Labyrinth and Drannith. Brian takes the hit and Lua ends the turn. Brian draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Talisman of Dominance and Ian draws through Remora. He casts an Arcane Signet and Ian draws again. Brian passes to Ian. During his upkeep, Ian lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Consecrated Sphinx. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and Consecrated Sphinx triggers. Ian draws 1 due to Spirit of the Labyrinth. Cal does nothing else and ends the turn. Lua draws, Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1 due to Spirit. Lua plays a City of Brass and moves to combat. She attacks Brian with Drannith and the Spirit. Brian takes it, and Lua passes. Brian draws, Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Plateau. He casts a Grim Monolith. He ships the turn to Ian. During his draw step, Ian takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He moves to combat, attacking Lua with Consecrated Sphinx. Lua takes it, and in his second main phase, Ian casts Wandering Archaic. In response, Brian casts Ad Nauseam. In response, Cal casts Swan Song, targeting Ad Nauseam. Ad Nauseam is countered, and Brian creates a 2/2 bird. Wandering Archaic resolves, and Ian passes the turn. At the end of Ian's turn, Cal casts Worldly Tutor. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Cal taps Ancient Tomb to pay for it. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Cal fetches up a Spellseeker onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Cal. Cal draws, Consecrated Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. He takes no other actions and passes to Lua. Lua draws, Sphinx triggers, and Ian draws 1. She plays a Windswept Heath for turn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. She recasts her commander, Winota. She moves to combat and attacks Brian with everything. Winota triggers twice. Lua looks at the top 6, putting Engrath's Marauders onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. She looks at the next 6, putting Imperial Recruiter onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ian. Imperial Recruiter triggers, and Lua fetches up a Rograk, Son of Rogaw, into her hand. Brian blocks the Spirit with his bird, and Ian blocks Imperial Recruiter with Wandering Archaic. Spirit dies, and then they both take the rest. In her second main phase, she casts Rograk. She ends her turn. Brian draws, and since Spirit of the Labyrinth is no longer on the battlefield, Ian draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. He does nothing else and passes. At the end of Brian's turn, Ian casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He then casts a Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the top of his library. Brian gives the turn to Ian. Ian draws and casts Hullbreaker Horror. He plays a Gaia's Cradle and then taps it for 3 green. He casts a Spellskite. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, and Ian returns Mox Opal to his hand. He casts Mox Opal, returning Mana Vault to his hand. He demonstrates a loop by casting and bouncing Mox Opal and Mana Vault, producing infinite mana of all colors. He ends the loop by bouncing Drannith Magistrate. He casts its commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He activates Kinnan an infinite number of times, putting all of his non-humans onto the battlefield, including Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios, drawing his deck and putting all of his lands onto the battlefield tapped. He then casts Finalia Devastation, where X equals 69,420, pumping all of his creatures, giving them haste, and then moving to combat. He attacks with everything, and Ian wins the game. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends the turn. Mike draws and pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Cal. He looks at Cal's hand and draws a card. He plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Toxic Deluge, paying 2 life as an additional cost. Cal wonders what in the world Mike is doing, and Malcolm dies. Mike laughs and passes the turn. Phil draws and plays a plains. He casts Alseid of Life's Bounty. He passes to Caleb. Caleb draws and plays a forest. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices the Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. He ends his turn. During Cal's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He ends the turn. Phil draws and plays a Battlefield Forge. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps Battlefield Forge to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Alseid. Winota triggers, Phil looks at the top 6 and puts Thalia's Lancers onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. Lancers enters and Phil fetches up a Squee, Dubious Monarch, into his hand. They all take it and Phil passes the turn. Caleb draws and plays a forest. He casts a Temur Sabertooth. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays an Otawara, Soin City as his land for turn. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He recasts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ends his turn. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with Tymna. Cal takes it and Mike gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ad Nauseam. With no answers, Ad Nause resolves. He reveals an opposition agent, Wheel of Fortune, Ancient Tomb, Demonic Consultation, Gemstone Caverns, City of Brass, Lavinia, Azorius Renegade, Swansong, Savine's Reclamation, Demonic Tutor, Underground Sea, Force of Will, Thassa's Oracle, Otawara Soaring City, Gamble, Jeweled Lotus, Brain Freeze, Final Fortune, Swords to Plowshares, Mnemonic Betrayal, Polluted Delta, Forbidden Orchard, Mystic Remora, and a Mindbreak Trap, killing him. The turn moves to Phil. During his upkeep, Phil wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Squee, Dubious Monarch. He casts a Ginger Brute. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with everything. Winota triggers 3 times and Squee triggers. Phil creates a 1/1 Goblin token tapped and attacking Cal. Then Phil looks at the top 6 and puts Blade Historian onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Cal. He looks at the next 6, putting Ethersworn Canonist onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. He looks at the next 6 one last time and puts Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Cal. Recruiter of the Guard triggers and Phil fetches up a Solitude into his hand. With no blocks, Caleb takes 4 and Cal takes 32. Phil passes the turn to Caleb. Caleb draws and casts Rishkar's Expertise. He draws 4 cards, but cannot cast anything for free due to Ethersworn Canonist. He moves to combat and attacks Phil with Temur Sabertooth. Phil declares no blocks and takes it. Caleb passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt flip, takes 3 damage, and dies. During his upkeep, Phil wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and moves directly to combat. He attacks Caleb with everything. Winota triggers 4 times and Squee triggers. Phil creates a 1/1 Goblin token, tapped and attacking Caleb. Then Phil looks at the top 6 and puts a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Caleb. He looks at the next 6 and puts a Magus of the Moon onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. He looks at the next 6 and puts Mother of Runes onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. He then looks at the last 6 and fails to find. Then Caleb takes 48 damage, dies, and Phil wins the game. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a turn 1 Mystic Remora. The table sighs, and Zach passes the turn. Jay draws and plays a forest. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He casts his commander, Yisan the Wanderer Bard. Jay passes. Travis draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt as well. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Travis casts a Rhystic Study and Zach draws from Remora. With 2 draw engines now on the battlefield, the table straps in and the turn moves to Kevin. Kevin draws and suggests everyone make a fish pack to ensure the draw engines do not get out of hand. The table agrees and Kevin plays a Wooded Foothills. He passes. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, misses his land drop, and passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a forest. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Travis loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts his commander, Rograk, son of Rogoth. He ships the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws, plays a forest, and passes. During his upkeep, Zach lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Gamble. Rhystic triggers and, in response, Jay activates Yisan for 1, fetching up an Allosaurus Shepherd onto the battlefield. Then Travis draws from Rhystic and Gamble resolves. Zach fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Cabal Ritual. He plays a Badlands and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a forest. He casts Manglehorn, paying the Rhystic tax. It enters and destroys Travis's Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Yisan and Allosaurus Shepherd. Zach takes it and Jay gives the turn to Travis. Travis draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe targeting Kevin. He looks at Kevin's hand and draws a card. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. Travis gives the turn to Kevin. Kevin draws and also pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe targeting Zach. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. Then Kevin looks at Zach's hand and draws a card. He plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Incubation Druid and Travis draws from Rhystic. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, Kevin passes. Zach draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Jay wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx as his land for turn. He activates Yisan for 2, fetching up a Collector Roof onto the battlefield. He casts a Court of Calling where X equals 5. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. In response, Zach flashes in a Dress Down and Travis draws again. Dress Down enters and Zach draws. With Chord still in the stack, Kevin casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling Thassa's Oracle, countering Court of Calling. Jay passes and Dress Down is sacrificed. Travis draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws and casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, paying the Rhystic tax. He casts Lightning Greaves and Travis draws from Rhystic again. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Kinnan. Zach takes it and Kevin chips the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Rhystic Study of his own. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. Rhystic resolves, the rest of the table gets worried, and Zach passes to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Yisan for 3, fetching up a Circle of Dreams Druid onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Kevin with Oof and Manglehorn. Kevin takes it, and Jay ends his turn. Travis draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. He passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws and plays an island. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Kinnan. Zach takes it, and Kevin ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zach casts Mystical Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Travis draws. Then Zach fetches up a Dam onto the top of his library. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver, and Travis draws from Rhystic. With nothing else, Zach passes to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Forest for turn. He activates Yisan for 4. In response, Kevin adapts Incubation Druid, adding 3+1/+1 counters. Still in response, Kevin casts Worldly Tutor. Both Rhystic's trigger and Travis and Zach draw. Then Kevin fetches up a Seedborn Muse onto the top of his library. Then Yisan resolves and Jay fetches up a Temur Sabertooth onto the battlefield. Next, Jay casts Craterhoof Behemoth. Rhystic triggers and Travis and Zach draw. Craterhoof enters and Jay's creatures get +7/+7 and gain trample until the end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Craterhoof, Manglehorn, Oof, and Allosaurus Shepherd. In response, Travis casts Chain of Vapor targeting Craterhoof. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. Craterhoof bounces and Travis takes the rest. With nothing else, Jay passes the turn. Travis draws and plays a Training Center. He casts a Mystic Remora. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. Remora resolves and Travis passes, discarding to hand size. Kevin draws and casts Consecrated Sphinx. The table groans and Kevin passes. During Zach's draw step, Kevin draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. Zach plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts an Overloaded Dam. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and Travis declines to draw due to Consecrated Sphinx. In response, Jay activates Temur Sabertooth, bouncing Circle of Dreams Druid, giving Temur Sabertooth indestructible until the end of turn. Then Dam resolves, destroying all creatures. Zach passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. Remora and 2 Rhystic's trigger, he pays for both Rhystic's, and Travis draws from Remora. He casts Circle of Dreams Druid, and both draw from Rhystic. He cracks his Lotus to help recast his commander, Yisan, and both draw from Rhystic again. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Temur Sabertooth. Travis takes it, and Jay passes the turn. During his upkeep, Travis lets his Remora die. He draws and casts Underworld Breach, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life, and exiling a blue card, paying for Rhystic. In response, Travis casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Force. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. Force of Will is countered, and with Breach still in the stack, Zach casts Pact of Negation. In response, Travis casts a Swan Song. Swan Song counters Pact, and Zach creates a 2/2 bird, and Underworld Breach resolves. Travis escapes Mana Crypt, and Zach draws from Rhystic. In response, Alan casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Underworld Breach and Travis's Rhystic Study. Both Rhystic's trigger and both draw. In response, Travis casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, and Zach draws from Rhystic. Force of Vigor is countered, Alan creates 2 treasures, and Mana Crypt resolves. Travis casts a Mox Opal, and Zach draws again. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond, and Zach draws. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga, paying the Rhystic tax. He cracks his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Polymorph, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Polymorph. Next, Travis escapes LED. He cracks it for 3 blue. He escapes LED again, Zach draws, and then he cracks it for 3 red. He casts Divergent Transformation targeting both Rograk and Jay Zson, and then Zach draws from Rhystic. Both are exiled, and Jay reveals a Priest of Titania, and Travis reveals a Hullbreaker Horror. Travis escapes LED, and Zach draws. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing Travis's Rhystic. He cracks it for 3 green. He escapes LED. Hullbreaker Horror triggers, bouncing his Mana Crypt. He casts Mana Crypt, bouncing his Mox Opal. Travis presents a loop of floating mana with both of his rocks and repeatedly bouncing them through Hullbreaker Horror over and over. He then generates infinite mana. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios with his infinite mana, drawing his deck and putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Jay. He casts Noxious Revival, putting Lightning Bolt back on top of his library. He draws Lightning Bolt with Thrasios and then casts it again, targeting Jay again. He casts Turn the Earth, shuffling both Lightning Bolt and Noxious Revival into his library, then draws both again through Thrasios. He presents another loop of casting Lightning Bolt on each opponent, then looping it with Turn the Earth and Noxious Revival. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Travis wins the game. Catherine draws and plays an Underground Sea. She casts a Mox Amber. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Roga. She casts a Mana Vault. She casts a turn 1 Time Twister. In response, Daquan casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling Mystic Remora. Twister is countered and exiled, and the turn moves to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Marsh Flats. Shedding a single tear for his Mystic Remora, Daquan gives the turn to Alan. Alan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to cast Grim Monolith. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Wooded Foothills. He casts a Birds of Paradise. In response, Daquan cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Birds resolves, and Alan passes the turn. Zach draws and plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Mystic Remora. In response, Daquan casts an Entomb, fetching up a Villas, Broker of Blood, into his graveyard. Remora resolves, and Zach follows it up by casting a Kraum Mox, imprinting Mental Misstep. He ships the turn to Catherine. During Catherine's draw step, she takes a damage from her Mana Vault. She plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Then Catherine fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. She gives the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts Reanimate, targeting Villas. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts Swan Song. In response, Daquan cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Veil of Summer. Remora triggers, and Zach draws again. Veil resolves, and Daquan draws. Swan Song fizzles, and Reanimate resolves. Villas returns to the battlefield, and Daquan loses 8 life. Villas triggers, and Daquan draws 8 cards. With nothing else, Daquan passes, discarding to hand size. Alan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 2. Rocco enters, and he fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters, and Alan creates 4 treasures. All set, he gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and casts a Mox Opal. He plays the Spire of Industry as his land for turn. He taps it to help cast Drannith Magistrate. Drannith resolves, and Zach ships the turn to Catherine. During Catherine's draw step, she takes a damage from her Mana Vault. She plays a Forbidden Orchard as her land for turn. She passes. Daquan draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it and pays a life. Villas triggers, and Daquan draws a card. Then he fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Daquan passes. Alan draws and casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Drannith. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Drannith dies, and he follows it up with a Food Chain. Remora triggers, and Zach draws again. Food Chain resolves, and Alan floats a red and exiles his Birds of Paradise to Food Chain, adding 2 green. He exiles Rocco to Food Chain, adding 4 red, putting Rocco into the command zone. He exiles Dockside for 3 white. He recasts his commander, Rocco, where X equals 3. In response, and with a delightfully wretched grin, Daquan flashes in, an opposition agent. Agent resolves, Rocco enters, and Daquan searches Alan's library and exiles a Skyclave Apparition. Dismayed, Alan gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays an Underground Sea. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He passes the turn. During her draw step, Catherine takes a damage from her Mana Vault. She plays a Luxury Suite and ships the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it and pays a life. Villas triggers, and Daquan draws. He then fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts Survival of the Fittest. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Survival. Next, Daquan casts a Drannith Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Catherine with Villas. In response, Catherine taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Jay a spirit to cast Ad Nauseam. Remora triggers, and Jay draws. In response, Daquan activates Villas, paying 2 life, drawing 2 cards, killing Rograk. He activates Villas, paying 2 life, drawing 2 cards, killing Rocco. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Ad Nauseam. Then Catherine takes the damage from Villas, and with nothing else, Daquan passes, discarding to hand size. Alan draws, takes no actions, and passes. During Zach's upkeep, he pays to keep his Remora. He draws and moves to combat, swinging Tymna at Alan and the Spirit Token at Catherine. They each take it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Tymna triggers, and Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn. He cracks it, paying a life. It is at this point that Daquan smiles again, and points out the opposition agent. He exiles a Tundra, looking at Zach's hand as well. Sorrowfully, Zach ships the turn to Catherine. During her draw step, Catherine takes a damage from her Mana Vault. With nothing else to do, she gives the turn to Daquan. During Daquan's upkeep, Zach casts Silence, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Daquan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He moves straight to combat, attacking Zach with Villas for his transgressions. Zach takes 8, and Daquan passes the turn. Alan draws, plays a Plateau, and passes. At the end of Alan's turn, Daquan cracks his Scalding Tarn, paying a life. Villas triggers and Daquan draws. He fetches up a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. Villas triggers again, and Daquan draws 2. The turn moves to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he lets his Remora die. He draws and moves to combat. In response, Daquan pays 2 life to activate Villas, targeting Zach's Spirit. Villas triggers and Daquan draws 2. The Spirit dies, and Zach attacks Catherine with Tymna. She takes it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Marsh Flats. He gives the turn to Catherine. During his upkeep, Catherine pays 4 to untap her Mana Vault. She draws and plays a Polluted Delta. She passes. At the end of Catherine's turn, Daquan casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Villas triggers and Daquan draws 2. The turn moves to Daquan. During his upkeep, Daquan casts Silence. Silence resolves, shutting out opponents from casting spells this turn. He draws and casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He plays Zach's Tundra as his land for turn. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Auriok Salvagers. He cracks his LED, discarding his hand, adding 3 white. He activates Auriok Salvagers, returning LED to his hand. Daquan presents a loop of sacrificing and returning LED through Auriok Salvagers to generate infinite mana of every color. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He activates Thrasios, drawing his library, putting all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Daquan wins the game. But Jay has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling a Windfall. Catherine draws a card for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. She casts her commander, Rograk, son of Rogah. She taps her Mana Confluence to cast an Imperial Seal. She fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. She passes the turn. At the end of Catherine's turn, Jay casts Demonic Consultation, naming Drannith Magistrate as it resolves. Jay exiles the top 6 of his library, and then the 7th card is Drannith Magistrate. The table curses Jay's luck, and the turn moves to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Drannith Magistrate. Jay ships the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays an Undergrowth Stadium. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He follows it up by casting a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Bloodstained Mire. He passes the turn. Zach draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Mana Vault. He gives the turn to Catherine. Catherine draws and casts a Mana Crypt. She casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Rograk as an additional cost. She fetches up a card into her hand and then passes the turn to Jay. Jay draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Zach with Drannith. Zach takes it, and Jay ships the turn to Daquan. Daquan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts a turn 2, Ad Nauseam. In response, Jay casts Miscast. Daquan corrects his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, paying for Miscast. Then Ad Nauseam resolves, and Daquan reveals a Mox Diamond, Abrupt Decay, Tenderwall, Plateau, Angel's Grace, Underworld Breach, Stomping Ground, Witherbloom Apprentice, Vampiric Tutor, Reign of Filth, Tainted Pact, Blood Crypt, Polluted Delta, Grand Abolisher, Dark Confidant, Savannah, Sacred Foundry, Beseju who shelters all, Simian Spirit Guide, Exotic Orchard, Scroll Rack, Ancient Tomb, Grim Monolith, Beseju who endures, Assassin's Trophy, Jessica's Will, Wheel of Fortune, Scrubland, Sylvan Library, Demonic Tutor, Jeweled Lotus, Chrome Mox, and an Esper Sentinel, deciding to stop there. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Sylvan Library. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Polluted Delta. He casts a Tenderwall. He sacrifices it, adding 2 red. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding another red. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Zach, adding 6 more red. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts a Scroll Rack. He cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Abrupt Decay, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Drannith is destroyed, and Daquan casts Underworld Breach. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He escapes Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He escapes Reign of Filth. He escapes LED again. He cracks it, discarding a Chain of Smog, adding 3 green. He sacrifices a land to add a black through Reign of Filth. He escapes Witherbloom Apprentice. He follows up by escaping Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Witherbloom Apprentice triggers, draining each opponent for 1, and Daquan gains 1. He demonstrates a loop of copying Chain of Smog, targeting himself, draining opponents through his Witherbloom Apprentice. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Daquan wins the game. Zach draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He passes. Alan draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He casts a Mox Diamond, pitching a Flooded Strand. He casts a turn 1 Drannith Magistrate. The table checks their hands for removal, and Alan ships it to Travis. Travis draws and starts off by casting Mox Amber. He casts a Kraum Mox. In response, Zach cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. Kraum Mox enters, and Travis imprints a Swan Song. He casts a Mana Vault. He follows up with an Arcane Signet. Finished up, Travis ends the turn. Jay draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Kraum Mox, imprinting Sylvan Tutor. He casts Chalice of the Void, where X equals 0. He casts Survival of the Fittest. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a Greed. He activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding a Boreal Druid, and fetches up a Collector Oof into his hand. Jay passes the turn. At the end of Jay's turn, Zach casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Rhystic Study onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Zach. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He passes. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Imperial Recruiter. Recruiter enters and he fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Jay with Drannith Magistrate. Jay takes it and Alan ships the turn to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He takes no other actions and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts a Collector Roof. The table settles in for a long one, and Jay ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Rhystic Study. He passes the turn. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Drannith and Imperial Recruiter. Zach takes it, and Alan ships the turn to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Vault. Locked out by Collector Oof, Travis gives the turn to Jay. During Jay's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding an Endurance. He fetches up a Magus of the Candelabra into his hand and sends the turn to Zach. Zach draws, holds open mana, and passes. During his upkeep, Alan loses another Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a High Market. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Drannith and Imperial Recruiter. Travis takes it, and the turn moves to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He does nothing else and passes. During Jay's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Forest. He follows it up with a Magus of the Candelabra. Rhystic Study triggers and Jay pays. He ends the turn. Zach draws, begs everyone to feed his Rhystic Study, does nothing else, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and ships the turn to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Jay wins his first Mana Crypt roll of the game. He draws and plays a Hall of the Bandit Lord. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Oof and Magus. Travis takes it, and Jay sends the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He passes to Alan. During Alan's upkeep, he finally wins a Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He suspends Greater Gargadon. He moves to combat and attacks Travis with Drannith and Imperial Recruiter. Travis takes it, and Alan passes the turn. During Travis's draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Solve the Equation. Rhystic Study triggers, and Zach draws. Solve the Equation resolves, and Travis fetches up a Chain of Vapor into his hand. He passes the turn to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps his Gaia's Cradle, floating 2 green. He taps his Magus of the Candelabra to untap the Cradle. He taps the Cradle, now floating 3 green total. He casts Expedition Map. Rhystic triggers, and Jay pays. Jay moves to combat and attacks Travis with Collector Oof. Travis declares no blocks, takes the hit, and Jay ships the turn. Zach draws, does nothing once again, and passes to Alan. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Dockside Extortionist, paying for Rhystic Study. Dockside enters, and Alan creates 10 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Drannith and Recruiter. Zach takes it, and Alan gives the turn to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He does nothing else and gives the turn to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding a Thought-Knot Seer. He fetches up a Kogla, the Titan Ape, into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Collector Oof and Magus. Zach takes it, and Jay passes the turn. Zach draws and casts a Mana Vault. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Beseiju, who endures as his land for turn. He casts a Wirewood Symbiote, paying the Rhystic tax. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Drannith, Dockside, and Recruiter. As the table's punching bag continues, Zach takes the hit. Alan passes the turn to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He curses the top deck gods, discards a Mox Diamond, and ships the turn. During his upkeep, Jay wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Oof and Magus. Zach continues to take it, and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws, sighs deeply, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and starts off his turn by casting Finale of Devastation, where X equals 3. Rhystic Study triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Jay activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding Temur Sabertooth. He fetches up an Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, into his hand. Still in response, Zach casts Mistcast, targeting Finale of Devastation. Finale is countered, and Alan moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Dockside, Draneth, Recruiter, and Wirewood Symbiote. Zach declares no blocks and takes the hit. Alan ships the turn to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Ball. He casts Faithless Looting. Rhystic triggers, and Travis taps his Ancient Tomb to pay. He draws 2 and discards 2. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn and passes. During his upkeep, Jay wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and does some Graveyard and Creature math. He taps his Gaia's Cradle and activates Magus to help cast Seedborn Muse. Rhystic triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts Intuition, targeting Travis. He fetches up a Thassa's Oracle, Force of Negation, and a Force of Will. Travis gives him the Force of Will. Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life, and exiling a blue card, targeting Seedborn Muse. Seedborn is countered, and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws for turn, holds up interaction, and passes. During Alan's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and starts off by evoking Fury, exiling a red card. Rhystic triggers, and Alan pays. In response, Zach casts Silence. Silence resolves, and Fury enters the battlefield. Alan kills Collector Oof and Magus of the Candelabra. Then Fury is sacrificed. Alan moves to combat and attacks Zach with everything. Zach takes it, and Alan passes the turn. At the end of Alan's turn, Jay cracks his Expedition map, fetching up a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, into his hand. The turn moves to Travis. During his draw step, Travis takes a damage from his Mana Ball. In his main phase, he casts a Relic of Legends, paying for Rhystic Study. Free from Collector Oof, but locked out by Draneth Magistrate, Travis passes to Jay. During Jay's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Nykthos as his land for turn. He activates Survival, discarding Kogla, and fetches up a Hope Tender into his hand. He taps his Hall of the Bandit Lord to help cast Hope Tender, paying the Rhystic tax. Hope enters and gains haste. Jay taps Hope Tender to untap his forest. He ends the turn. Zach draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. It is at this point that Zach is reminded of Jay's Chalice of the Void, and Jeweled Lotus is countered. Zach casts a Talisman of Indulgence and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Alan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and starts off by cracking 2 treasures to help cast Grand Abolisher, paying for Rhystic Study. After conversing with the table, Travis casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Wirewood Symbiote. Rhystic triggers, and Zach draws. Symbiote dies, and in response to Grand Abolisher, Zach casts Pact of Negation, which gets countered by Chalice of the Void. With no other answers, Grand Abolisher resolves. Alan casts a Temur Sabertooth, paying for Rhystic Study. Alan then presents a loop of activating Sabertooth to bounce Dockside, and then recasting Dockside to make infinite treasures, paying all of the Rhystic triggers each time. He casts Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 4. Rocco enters and fetches up an Arena Rector onto the battlefield. Alan sacrifices Rector to Greater Gargadon, removing a suspend counter. When Rector dies, it triggers and Alan exiles it. He fetches up a Vivian on the hunt onto the battlefield. He activates Vivian's first ability, sacrificing Rocco, and fetches up a Felidar Guardian onto the battlefield. Felidar triggers and Alan flickers his Vivian. He activates the new instance of Vivian, sacrificing his Felidar, and fetches up a Karmic Guide onto the battlefield. Karmic Guide enters, reanimating the Felidar Guardian. Felidar enters and flickers Vivian. Alan activates Vivian, sacrificing Felidar to fetch up a Kiki Jiki, Mirror Breaker, onto the battlefield. Alan activates Kiki Jiki, creating a copy of Karmic Guide. The token of Karmic Guide enters and reanimates Felidar Guardian. Felidar enters and flickers Kiki Jiki. Alan then presents a loop of activating Kiki, creating infinite hasty copies of Felidar Guardian, swings at his opponents for lethal, and Alan wins the game. But Travis has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling a Flooded Strand. Jay draws a card for turn and plays a Forest. He casts Burgeoning. Jay passes. Zach draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. Burgeoning triggers, and Jay puts an Emergent Zone onto the battlefield. Zach cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He follows it up with a Mana Ball. Zach ships the turn to Alan. Alan draws and plays a Command Tower. Burgeoning triggers, and Jay puts a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. Alan casts a Mana Crypt. Alan takes a deep dive into the Brain Tank and then emerges by casting a Kraum Mox. It enters and he imprints a Temur Sabertooth. Everyone is concerned with what happened in that tank, and Alan casts a Wirewood Symbiote. All through, he passes. At the end of Alan's turn, Travis casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Dramatic Reversal onto the top of his library. Travis draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Yisan the Wanderer Bard. He casts an Expedition map. He ships the turn. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Alan with Ragaman. Alan takes it, Ragaman triggers, Alan exiles Skyclave Apparition, and Zach creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Zach plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He passes the turn to Alan. During his upkeep, Alan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Reflecting Pool. He casts his commander, Rocco, Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 2. Rocco enters, and Alan fetches up a Grand Abolisher onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Travis draws and taps his City of Brass to cast a Mana Vault. He casts Isochron Scepter. Kraum triggers, and Zach draws. Isochron Scepter resolves, and Travis imprints Dramatic Reversal. He activates Isochron Scepter, untapping all of his non-land permanents. Travis presents a loop of tapping Mana Vault, activating Isochron, and untapping both, netting infinite colorless mana. He uses this mana to activate Thrasios, drawing his deck, putting all lands into play tapped. He casts his Mana Rocks through his infinite colorless mana and repeats the Isochron Scepter loop to generate infinite red and green mana. He casts Lightning Bolt, dealing 3 to Alan. He casts Turn the Earth, shuffling Lightning Bolt back into his library and gains 2 life. He casts Noxious Revival, putting Turn the Earth on top of his library. He activates Thrasios, drawing Turn the Earth and Lightning Bolt. He does this process again, but now he shuffles Noxious Revival and Lightning Bolt back into his library through Turn the Earth. He presents a loop of bolting his opponents until they are dead, and Travis wins the game. Ryan draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Llanowar Elves. Ryan passes. Chad draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an island. Chad ends his turn. Zach draws, plays a City of Brass, and passes. Cal draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mana Vault. Cal ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts Imperial Recruiter. In response, Chad cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Drain, countering Recruiter. Ryan shifts the turn. Chad draws, and in his first main phase, he has 3 colorless through Mana Drain. He plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts his commander, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. Chad passes. Zach draws, plays a Volcanic Island, and passes. Cal draws and plays a Shatter Skull, the Hammer Pass, into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts his commander, Prosper, Tomebound. He moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles Cabal Ritual. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and also plays a Shatter Skull, the Hammer Pass, into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts Survival of the Fittest. Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Chad cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool into play tapped. Chad draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts Carpet of Flowers. Rashmi triggers, and Chad reveals a Veil of Summer into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Rashmi. Zach takes it, and Chad passes the turn. At the end of Chad's turn, Zach casts a Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. Zach draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Chad channels Beseiju, who endures, targeting Survival of the Fittest. In response, Ryan activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding Skyclave Apparition and fetching up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Then Survival is destroyed, and Ryan fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. With Dockside still on the stack, Chad casts Reset. Rashmi triggers, and Chad reveals a Dispel into his hand. With Reset still on the stack, Ryan casts Eladamri's Call. He fetches up an Arena Rector into his hand. Then Reset resolves, and Chad untaps his lands. Then Dockside resolves, and Zach creates 4 treasures. Zach casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Wheel of Fortune. Ryan sighs, and Chad responds by casting Veil of Summer, drawing a card as it resolves. Chad then flashes in a Dress Down. It enters, and he draws a card again. Then everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Zach casts a Lion's Eye Diamond and passes the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Dress Down is sacrificed. Cal draws and plays a Black Cleave Cliffs into play untapped. He casts Lelia, the Blade Reforged. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Lelia. Lelia triggers, and Cal exiles Culling the Weak off of the top of his library. Lelia triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Cal casts Cabal Ritual from exile. Prosper triggers, and Cal creates a treasure, then he adds 3 black. He casts Mayhem Devil. Cal moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles Bolus's Citadel. Lelia triggers and gets a counter. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Carpet of Flowers. He moves to a second main phase and adds 2 green through his carpet. He casts Birds of Paradise. He casts Avacyn's Pilgrim. He casts Elvish Mystic. He casts a Soul Ring. Now just swimming in mana, Ryan passes to Chad. Chad draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 2 blue through his carpet. He plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it and pays a life. Mayhem Devil triggers and kills Ryan's Birds of Paradise. He then fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts Jin-Gitaxias, Progress Tyrant. The entire table groans as Rashmi triggers. In response, Chad pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, putting Manglehorn from his graveyard onto the top of his library. Then Rashmi's trigger resolves, Chad reveals Manglehorn, casting it. It enters and targets Cal's mana vault. In response, Cal casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Manglehorn's ability, redirecting it to Chad's Mox Diamond. Diamond is destroyed, then Jin-Jitaxis resolves. Chad casts Lotus Petal. Jin-Jitaxis triggers and Chad creates a copy. Chad moves to combat and attacks Zack with Rashmi. Zack takes it, and all through, Chad ends his turn. Zack draws and plays a command tower. He casts Talisman of Creativity. Jin-Jitaxis triggers, countering the spell. Zack casts Arcane Signet, entering tapped through Manglehorn. Zack passes. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zack with Lelia. Lelia triggers and Cal exiles Overmaster, giving Lelia a counter. Then Zack takes it, and in his second main phase, Cal casts Overmaster from exile. Prosper and Jin-Jitaxis trigger. Overmaster is countered, and Cal creates a treasure into play tapped through Manglehorn. He plays a Snow-Covered Swamp for turn. He casts Bolus's Citadel from exile. Prosper triggers, and Cal creates a tapped treasure. Citadel enters tapped, Cal looks at the top card of his library and then moves to his end step. Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles Command Tower. Lelia triggers and gets a counter. Still in the end step, Ryan flashes in a Cathar Commando. Then Ryan sacrifices it, targeting Bolus's Citadel. Mayhem Devil triggers and kills Ryan's Avacyn's Pilgrim. Then Citadel is destroyed, and the turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, he has 3 green through his carpet. He plays a Horizon Canopy for turn. He casts his commander, Rocco Cabaretti Caterer, where X equals 4. He fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos onto the battlefield. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Wirewood Symbiote into his hand. Ryan ends his turn. Chad draws, and in his first main phase, he has 2 blue through his carpet. He casts Wandering Archaic. Rashmi triggers, and Chad reveals a Wooded Foothills into his hand. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He cracks it and pays a life. Mayhem Devil triggers and deals a damage to Manglehorn. He then fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts Talisman of Curiosity. Jin-Jitaxis triggers and creates a copy. Chad ships the turn to Zack. Zack draws and plays a Tundra. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. He cracks his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. Mayhem Devil triggers and kills Ryan's Llanowar Elves. Zack casts his other commander, Kraum Ludovic's Opus. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Kraum. Cal takes it, and in his second main phase, he pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Zack passes the turn. During his draw step, Cal takes a damage from his mana vault. In his main phase, he plays a command tower from exile through Prosper. Prosper triggers, and in response, Cal cracks both of his treasures, floating to red. Mayhem Devil triggers twice and kills Manglehorn. Then Cal creates a treasure through Prosper. Next, Cal casts Reckless Impulse. Jin-Jitaxis and Wandering Archaic trigger. Cal pays for Wandering Archaic, and Reckless Impulse is countered. Cal moves to combat and attacks Chad with Lelia. Lelia triggers, Cal exiles Demonic Tutor, and Lelia gets a counter. Chad takes 7, and in his second main phase, Cal casts Demonic Tutor from exile. Prosper, Archaic, and Kraum all trigger. Zack draws, Cal pays for Archaic, and then creates a treasure. Then Cal fetches up a card into his hand. Cal moves to his end step and exiles Deadly Dispute through Prosper. Lelia triggers and gets a counter. Still in the end step, Chad casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Ranger Captain. Jin-Jitaxis and Rashmi trigger. Chad reveals a Void Winnower into his hand through Rashmi, and then creates a copy of Rift, targeting Lelia. Lelia bounces, then Ranger Captain bounces. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, he has 3 white through his carpet. He recasts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and he fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. Ryan passes the turn. Chad draws, and in his first main phase, he has 3 green through his carpet. Chad convokes Court of Calling, where X equals 7. Rashmi and Jin-Jitaxis trigger. Chad creates a copy, and then fetches up a Nyx Bloom Ancient onto the battlefield. He then reveals a Spellseeker through Rashmi, casting it. Kraum triggers, and Zack draws. It enters, and Chad fetches up a Delay into his hand. Then the original chord resolves, and Chad fetches up a Coma, Cosmos Serpent, onto the battlefield. Next, Chad taps his mana for triple through Nyx Bloom Ancient and casts Void Winnower. It resolves, and Chad ends his turn. During Zack's upkeep, Chad creates a Serpent through Coma. Zack draws and moves to combat. He attacks Chad with Kraum. Chad takes it, and in his second main phase, Tymna triggers. In response, Zack casts Enlightened Tutor. Jin-Jitaxis and Wandering Archaic trigger. Zack doesn't pay, Chad copies it, and fetches up an Isochron Scepter onto the top of his library. Then Jin-Jitaxis counters Enlightened Tutor. With the Tymna trigger still in the stack, Zack casts Vampiric Tutor. Archaic triggers, Chad copies it, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Zack also fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life as well. He then pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. Zack casts Toxic Deluge, paying 9 life. In response, Chad cracks his Lotus Petal to cast Delay. Mayhem Devil, Jin-Jitaxis, and Rashmi all trigger. Chad reveals a Nexus of Fate into his hand, copies Delay targeting Toxic Deluge, then Cal kills Ryan's Elvish Mystic. Then Delay counters and exiles Toxic Deluge with 3 time counters on it. With no other answers and shut down completely, Zack passes to Cal. During Cal's upkeep, Chad creates a Serpent off of Coma. During his draw step, Cal takes a damage from his mana vault. He plays a Mountain for turn. Cal recasts Lelia. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Lelia. Lelia triggers, Cal exiles Mana Confluence, and Lelia gets a counter. Ryan blocks with Rocco, and both die. Cal moves to his end step and exiles Baleful Mastery through Prosper. The turn moves to Ryan. During Ryan's upkeep, Chad creates a Serpent through Coma. Ryan draws, resigns to his fate, and passes to Chad. Everyone sees that they are dead to Chad's lock, concede, and Chad wins the game. Chad draws a card for turn and plays a Tropical Island. He casts a Noble Hierarch and passes the turn. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to cast a Felwar Stone. Zach ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Skirk Prospector and passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Sol Ring. He casts an Arcane Signet. Ryan ships the turn. Chad draws and plays an Otawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts Green Sun Zenith where X equals 2. He fetches up a Hermit Druid onto the battlefield, shuffling Green Suns back into his library. The team realizes that they are in trouble as Chad gives the turn to Zach. At the end of Chad's turn, Zach casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Wheel of Fortune onto the top of his library. Zach draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Wheel of Fortune. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Zach casts Mox Opal and passes to Cal. Cal draws, plays a Marsh Flats, and passes. Ryan draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Elf as it enters. He casts Arbor Elf. He casts a Wild Growth and sends the turn to Chad. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Also in the end step, Cal cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. Cal casts a Braid, killing Chad's Hermit Druid. The turn moves to Chad. Chad draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. Chad passes. Zach draws and plays a Plateau. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Talisman of Dominance. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Zach gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Command Tower. He cracks his Skirk Prospector to cast his commander, Prosper Tomebound. He moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and Cal exiles Wooded Foothills off of the top of his library. Cal passes. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts its commander, Rocco Cabaret Caterer, where X equals 4. He fetches up an Arena Rector onto the battlefield. Ryan casts Reckless Rage, targeting Rashmi and his own Arena Rector. In response, Zach casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Reckless Rage is countered, and Ryan creates 2 treasures. Next, Ryan casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Ancient Tomb. Ryan suspends Greater Gargadon. He activates Greater Gargadon, sacrificing Arena Rector to remove a suspend counter. Arena Rector triggers, and in response, Zach exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting Ryan. Ryan then mills 15 cards, including his Kiki Jiki. Then Arena Rector's ability resolves, Ryan exiles it, and fetches up a Vivian on the Hunt onto the battlefield. He activates Vivian's first ability, sacrificing Rocco, and fetches up a Felidar Guardian onto the battlefield. Felidar enters, and Ryan flickers Vivian on the Hunt. Ryan activates Vivian, sacrificing Felidar, and fetches up a Karmic Guide onto the battlefield. Karmic Guide enters and reanimates Felidar Guardian. Felidar enters and flickers Karmic Guide. Karmic Guide enters and reanimates Kiki Jiki. Ryan activates Kiki, creating a copy of Felidar Guardian. Ryan presents a loop of flickering Kiki with his copies of Felidar Guardian, then creating a copy of Felidar, creating infinite Felidar tokens. Ryan moves to combat, attacks with its infinite hasty Felidars, and Ryan wins the game. Alex draws and starts off by casting Chrome Mox, imprinting Tishana, Voice of Thunder. He plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts an Elvish Mystic. Alex passes. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Sol Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. Peter ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Ashani ships the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Grafdigger's Cage, much to the dismay of most of the table. Charles gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Rhystic Study. Alex ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Homeward Path. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Peter pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Blood Pet. Kirik and Rhystic trigger, Alex draws, and Kirik gets a counter. Finished up, Peter passes. Ashani draws, plays an Ancient Tomb, and passes. Charles draws and casts Land Tax. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Charles passes. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Alex ends his turn. Peter draws and starts off by paying 6 life through Kirik to cast Beseech the Queen, paying the Rhystic Tax. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a Demonic Tutor into his hand. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor, paying the Rhystic Tax. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Dark Ritual. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter pays for Rhystic. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter pays 6 life to help cast Peer into the Abyss, paying the Rhystic Tax, and Kirik gets a counter. In response, Ashani casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Then Ashani adds 3 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Ashani reveals a Misty Rainforest, Otawara Soaring City, Mana Vault, Jataxian Probe, Wheel of Misfortune, Mana Confluence, Dispel, Badlands, Mystic Remora, Windfall, Talisman of Creativity, Toxic Deluge, Brain Freeze, Chrome Mox, Snap, Underground Sea, Rhystic Study, Ranger Captain of Eos, Dockside Extortionist, Dramatic Reversal, Verdant Catacombs, Plateau, Silence, Chain of Vapor, Red Elemental Blast, Jeweled Lotus, and a Dothy Voidwalker, deciding to stop there. Unfortunately, he did not find any free interaction, and Peter resolves. Peter draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. Peter plays a City of Traders for turn. He cast a Mana Vault. He cast an Aetherflux Reservoir. He casts Mox Amber. Alex draws through Rhystic, and Peter gains 7 life through Aetherflux. Peter pays 2 life to cast Rain of Filth. Kirik, Aetherflux, and Rhystic all trigger. Alex draws through Rhystic, Peter gains 8 life, and then Kirik gets a counter. In response, Alex casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Rain of Filth. Peter pays 2 life to cast Blood Celebrant. Alex draws, Kirik gets a counter, and Peter gains 9 life. He activates Blood Celebrant 4 times, paying 12 life, adding 4 black. He pays 4 more life to help cast Professor Onyx. Kirik, Aetherflux, and Rhystic all trigger. Peter pays 3 life through Blood Celebrant to pay for Rhystic. Peter gains 10 life through Aetherflux, and then Kirik gets a counter. Then Onyx resolves. Peter activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He casts Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Kirik, Aetherflux, Professor Onyx, and Rhystic all trigger. Peter pays 3 life through Blood Celebrant to pay for Rhystic. Each opponent loses 2 and Peter gains 2 through Onyx. Peter gains 11 life through Aetherflux, then Kirik gets a counter. With no answers, Chain of Smog resolves. Peter discards 2 cards and copies the chain, targeting himself. Each time he copies the chain, Professor Onyx triggers and each opponent loses 2 life. He does this over and over until the table is dead and Peter wins the game.